Hey people, Shinobi no Kami here. In this fanfic, due to a tragic event, Naruto awakens the Rinnegan and becomes a monk. How will this affect the timeline? Will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of this new power leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy it. Tell me your thoughts in the comments section. So without any further ado, let's roll the intro. Chapter 63, Clouds Part 1. A clever person solves a problem. A wise person avoids it. Albert Einstein. Huge blasts of light rent apart the sky in a conflagration of color and noise as the odd population of one of Hai no Kuni's larger and more prosperous towns watched on, enraptured. Great, deafening cracks held their attentions as animals all around the area winced from the booming explosions high above, birds scattering to find somewhere quieter to roost. However, that went unnoticed to the celebrating citizens of the town, decked out in their fanciest and most colorful kimonos and yukatas as they moved through the bustling streets. Sparklers were held by running children as they dashed about, laughing and playing or trying out some of the many stall games that were brightly advertised along the streets. This was the scene that 4 teenagers, each around 16, entered into as they walked into the town, 3 of them feeling incredibly underdressed in their more casual clothing. The boy at the lead was forced to dodge out of the way of a group of kids as they ran past, giggling and waving their colorful sparklers in the air. He was tall for his age, standing around 5'9", and actually appeared to be taller thanks to his long, spiky hair that traveled down to his shoulder blades as a scruffy, untidy ponytail. Another great flash of light from the fireworks above them lit him up, revealing the golden color of his unruly locks. The girl at the back of the group cursed quietly as one of the kids stood on her foot, her long, vivid red hair whipping around like a crimson waterfall as she turned to glare at them, not that her angry look could even start to faze the young kids as they merrily ran off. She simply turned back with a slight scowl, muttering something to herself as the boy beside her, slightly taller than her but with equally long, raven black hair, smirked. Most people would say he had distinctly feminine features about him, like his small, cute nose and his elegant, slim frame that was accented by a deep blue kimono. The final person of their group simply observed the running youths with a soft, amused smile, easily stepping around them with the grace and poise only noble women or kunoichi could ever hope to possess. Her shoulder-length, messy green hair, the color of a pale mint leaf, flowed with her movements, highlighting her contrasting dark skin. A pair of sparkling orange eyes followed the movements of the children with a carefree expression as she turned back to her friends, a small smile continuing to light up her young features. It is quite the lively town. The boy at the lead just grinned slightly, leaning on the long and old-looking wooden shakuju he carried as he had a habit of doing. I think we caught it on a good day. The darker-haired boy just chuckled as he looked around at the cacophony of sights and sounds flooding their senses. You could say that Naruto. The blonde's grin only widened as he took a deep breath, enjoying the scent of various sweet foods lingering in the air, tantalizing his taste buds. It had been so long since they had had any kind of sweets, living off of what they could catch and gather for the past 3 years. Well, in any case, we should go find a hotel or an inn. We've been traveling for a while now and we should all get some rest. The redhead at the back of the group, having recovered from her small cursing fit, just threw an incredulous look the blonde's way as she snorted loudly. Yeah, as if Blondie. I've never gotten to experience one of these festival things before and they look like a good fucking time. With that, she smirked at the group before grabbing Haku's arm roughly. Now if you don't mind, I'll be borrowing femboy here, see you at the hotel. Or whatever. With that, she gave a nonchalant wave, casually and playfully flipping them off in what they knew to be a friendly, for her, gesture and walked off, pulling Haku along by his arm. Why am I the one that has to go with you? Tayuya just smirked up at Haku, somewhat annoyed by the difference in their height that 3 years had brought, but hiding it much better than her younger self would have. Easy, I want some food and you have money. She raised an amused eyebrow at the ice wielder's impassive gaze as he allowed himself to be dragged along by the redhead, more than used to it by now. Get where I'm going with this, Haku-chan. The dark-haired Yuki merely sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly in defeat, which gave to Yuya a small grin of elation as she pumped her fist. Alright then, Dango awaits. Naruto could only watch with an amused smile as two of his closest friends walked off together, vanishing into the maelstrom of activity that was the festival. I think they need this. Naruto began walking as Fu naturally gravitated to his side, slightly less self-conscious now that their other friends were gone. Naruto just raised a blonde eyebrow, not bothering to turn to Fu as they walked, too taken in by all the wonderful things going on around them. Oh, he already had an idea of what Fu meant, but he enjoyed hearing things from the girl. Her opinions and thoughts were always important to him. Unfortunately, even 3 years had been unable to change the fact that Fu was a naturally introverted person, rarely speaking up unless she was either genuinely interested or it concerned her or a person she cared about, of which the list was very short. I don't imagine that any person in our group has ever experienced a festival before. I have read about them in many books, but never participated. She looked up at Naruto expectantly, but the blonde shook his head. During his time in Konoha, he had either been too young to understand festivals or had feared the intense looks of hatred and apathy he would get if he tried to join one. He imagined it was much the same with Yuya and Haku, both of whom hadn't led lives that would have allowed them to experience such frivolities. Nobody in our group has ever truly had a normal childhood, trained from young ages to be weapons, fighters, or completely removed from normal society. She smiled softly as a small puppy ran past excitedly, barking enthusiastically as a young girl chased after it, just as happy as the little animal. It is nice to experience things like this, even if only for a short time. She blinked in surprise when she realized Naruto was no longer at her side, not having even felt him move away. I think you're right. She turned, spotting Naruto standing over by a large stall, its sign proudly advertising the fish catching that it was hosting. The blonde monk stood near to it, waving Fu over with an excited grin. The young Jinchuriki just paused before smiling in return, walking over to the blonde with an amused smile. Above them, fireworks continued to blast into the sky, lighting it up in a myriad of colors and sparkling patterns, drowning out any negative thoughts one could be having on such a joyous night. Ooh, colorful aren't they? Two men stood atop a high ridge overlooking the village, their dark cloaks helping them blend in with the darkening night. It was only the occasional flash of green or blue that would light up their features as high above them fireworks cast their features into eerie, flickering shadows. The one that had spoken was a very large man with an intimidating build, but his features cast into shadow by the low Sugagasa hat he wore, the small talismans and bells hanging off the edges jingling every time he moved his head. Why did we come here? His companion, a much smaller man with a softer and almost toneless voice, stood next to him, gazing at the village with an indiscernible expression. His dark eyes were impassive, uncaring even, and only held the barest flickers of interest at the exciting and enrapturing sights happening below them. He too wore a decorated Sugagasa over his head, shadowing much of his features but revealing his rather pale skin. Oh come on now, we should get to kick back every so often, and a festival is the perfect way to do that. Some sake, maybe a few women. The smaller, slighter man sighed at the suggestive tone in his companion's voice. Even an emotionless guy like you should be able to appreciate that, right? The larger man turned, the expectant look in his beady eyes hidden by his hat, even though he was sure his friend would be able to spot it from his body language. Very well, but make it quick. A sharp, toothy grin made its way across the bigger man's face as he turned back to the village in front of them, rubbing his hands together excitedly. I knew it, even someone like you has to have fun once in a while. His eyes gained a devious glint as he spotted a group of women dressed in fine kimonos and yukatas moving through the packed streets, giggling and talking among one another as they expertly weaved through the throngs of people like true natives. Now then, shall we hit the casinos or enjoy something on the softer side? His partner stayed quiet, simply turning away from the larger man and walking off towards the town. The bigger man simply shrugged, his grin returning full force as he followed after his companion, his dark, high-collared wrap fluttering in the breeze. High above them another bright flash erupted across the sky, illuminating the large, puffy red clouds that decorated their black cloaks. This is strange, none of the games here seem particularly difficult. What is the point without challenge? Naruto just chuckled as he walked along beside Fu, each holding a slowly steaming stick of sweet-smelling dango as they moved through the throngs of festival-goers. I don't think the point is for them to be difficult, you are just supposed to have fun. He pointed to a young couple, around their age, that were standing in front of a ring toss stand. The boy had a determined look on his face as he tossed one ring after another, each one just narrowly missing its mark as it made little clattering sounds. The girl just stood to his side, a bright smile on her face as she cheered him on, finally erupting in a large cheer as the boy finally managed to snag one of the rings. See, they're just here to have fun. Fu watched on curiously as the stall's owner gave a toy the boy, who quickly passed it on to the girl. Her eyes widened slightly as the girl looked down shyly, a little blush staining her cheeks as she quickly and embarrassedly leaned forward and pecked the boy on the cheek, smiling softly to herself as she turned and walked off. The boy wasn't far behind her, a stupid grin on his face and a small blush of his own. Fu blinked once at the alien interaction before looking up at Naruto, noticing he was watching the couple move off as well. Could you win me something? Naruto paused for a moment, blinking in amazement at the timid, slightly confused tone to Fu's voice. He frowned, knowing that even without chakra Fu would easily be able to win any of these stall games, they were made for untrained children after all. However, he saw no reason to say anything on it as he allowed a grin to slip onto his face. Sure, come on. Fu was a little surprised when Naruto grabbed her by the hand and led her over to the nearest stall, a rubber ball scooping game. The stall owner smiled congenially at the, just another teenage couple, he saw and quickly handed Naruto a small stack of 3 simply paper scoops. Naruto could have easily channeled chakra through the paper, reinforcing it and even waterproofing it, but he was naturally honest by nature, so just decided to take the game for what it was. He grabbed one of the offered bowls and after a moment of thought dipped the little scoop into the water, quickly flicking up one of the balls into the bowl without even breaking the scoop. The stall owner seemed a little surprised by how easily he had done it, but that was nothing compared to when Naruto repeated the process 3 more times before the paper finally broke. Wow, that's pretty impressive, kid, you come to festivals often then? Naruto rubbed the back of his head sheepishly as he looked at the other scoops he still had left. No, it's actually my first time. The stall owner just smiled at the perceived young couple as he gestured to the small shelf of prizes at the back on the stand. Well then, the lucky beginner gets to pick one of those prizes. Naruto quickly saw the one he wanted to get, a white plush wolf with red markings across its body and what appeared to be a small halo of fire stitched to its back. It was a cartoonish representation of the goddess Amaterasu that had become popular as of late with artists. Almost as soon as it was in his hands he passed it along to Fu, who simply stared at it for a moment, more and more red beginning to spread across her cheeks. Thank you. Naruto was about to tell her it was nothing, but she silenced anything he could have said as she leant forward, standing on her toes to account for the slight height difference, and kissed him softly on the lips. When she finally leant back out, she had a satisfied smile on her face as she clutched the little plush wolf to her chest almost like a normal teenage girl. And no problem. Naruto still wasn't used to the kissing with Fu, even after all this time it gave him a warm tingling feeling in his stomach. In his slight daze he managed to turn and absently knock the other paper scoops to the ground by accident. Blinking out of his stupor he immediately bent to pick them up again, only for someone else to beat him to it. Hey, you should be more careful, Gaki, you only get a few of these. Naruto's eyebrow rose a little at the blue skin of the man offering the scoops back to him, as well as the black nail polish on his hands. He also wore an ornate yellow ring that had the kanji for south on his left ring finger, but anything else about the man was hidden beneath his high-collared black cloak and face shadowing Sugagasa. Thank you. He couldn't see it through the shadows cast by the man's hat, but he could almost feel the vicious grin the blue-skinned man was giving him. Hey, no problem, kid. With that the large, imposing man stood back up, letting Naruto notice that he had a companion dressed in similarly concealing attire. However, more frightening was the fact that Naruto could practically feel the enormous chakra emanating off of both of them even without his water-sensing ability. Be more careful next time. Naruto ignored the slightly mocking tone as the enormous man walked off, his smaller, quieter partner following after him without a word, but not before pausing to look at Naruto one last time. Are you okay, Naruto? The blonde shook his head quickly as he realized he had been staring after the two, enraptured by the chakra they just casually gave off, even if the smaller one was hiding his own better. He looked around to Fu, who had been tugging lightly on his robe's sleeve, also staring after the two men. We should go find Tayuya and Haku, get some rooms for the night before they're all booked up. Fu paused, feeling as though Naruto was leaving something out, but ignored that as she nodded slowly, allowing herself to be led off by the boy, stuffed wolf still held protectively against her chest. Down the street the two cloaked men continued to casually stroll through the crowds, the smaller opting to weave through the people like a ghost, never touching anyone, while the larger man practically parted the crowds with his mere presence. The more observant and less drunken festival goers would have noticed that the enormous bandage-wrapped object on the man's back seemed to be moving slightly, a clicking, groaning sound like scales rubbing together occasionally sounding from beneath the white wrappings. Oh, is that right? The large, blue-skinned man gained an amused smirk as he spared a glance at his partner, who was looking ahead expressionlessly. Samahata has some interesting information for us, what do you think? Itachi. The younger man said nothing for a few moments as they kept walking before finally looking up at his partner. For the briefest of moments, two deep red eyes peered out of the shadows cast on his face like some eerie Cheshire cat. Go on, Kisame. You know, all these people really don't make tracking the Gaki's chakra any easier. You should give me more credit, Itachi. Kisame waited for a reply from his stoic comrade as they made their way through the various crowds of people. The festival was beginning to wind down as people either flocked to their homes or their hotels. Only the teens and couples that wanted to preserve the romantic night air stayed out as the moon began to reach its zenith in the sky. But you are still able to track him. Kisame just sighed. There Itachi went again with his monotone, disinterested voice. It was like speaking to an only mildly talkative rock that had amazing prowess as a shinobi. Yeah, once Samahata's got the scent, she's better than any ninkin, although who would have thought we'd be the first to find our Jinchuriki, Itachi. The younger Uchiha made no indication he had heard his larger, more vicious partner as the trail began to lead them towards a hotel near the fringes of the town. It does seem unlikely considering the Kyuubi Jinchuriki and the Nanabi Jinchuriki are the only ones leader Sama was unable to locate. Kisame just gave his shark-like grin as he rubbed his hands together excitedly. All the better for us, partner. Kakuzu is going to be annoyed that we got ours first. Under all that talk of money, I can tell he's the competitive type. The shark-emulating man chuckled to himself as they began to ascend the steps to the balcony of the second-floor rooms. Must be why he keeps killing all his partners by accident, the former Kiri-nin ended his statement with air quotes. Although I guess that's not a problem now with that weird new guy. Itachi ignored his partner's ramblings as they finally came to a stop in front of one of the rooms. Is this it? Kisame halted mid-sentence before nodding, becoming more professional but never losing the toothy grin. Itachi once again ignored his more enthusiastic partner as he quickly rapped on the door 3 times. Only showing marginal surprise as it almost instantly opened, revealing a teen boy with bright spiky hair and a soft smile. It was strange as Itachi remembered when he had been much younger, when he was still in the Anbu, seeing this same boy that could barely be higher than his waist. Now they were around the same height. Naruto Uzumaki. None of his surprise or thoughtfulness made it into his even, steady voice, and Naruto's smile widened slightly for it. It almost reminded the young monk of a male version of Fu. Yes, how could I help you? Again both men were a little perturbed by the calm, uncaring demeanor the boy had and how easily he gave away his identity. After all, this had been one of the Jinchuriki even Zetsu had been unable to track. They had simply assumed he was in hiding. There was also the fact that 2 S-class shinobi were standing in front of him, a large amount of their chakra saturating the air, and he was simply looking at them with curiosity and that same gentle smile. Oh good, we got the right one, that makes things a lot easier. Naruto turned to the larger of the 2 men, his eyebrow rising a little. You know, it's a little strange talking like this out in the corridor, why don't you come in? You've obviously been traveling for some time. He was referring to the slight layer of dust and dirt that had accumulated along the bottom of their cloaks as well as the generally disheveled appearance of the clothing. I have tea. Finally Itachi allowed his eyebrow to quirk up slightly, the oddness of the situation finally getting to him. I'm afraid we don't have time for that, Naruto-kun, you will have to be coming with us now. To both men's great surprise, Naruto simply blew air between his teeth in amusement, waving his hand nonchalantly and walking back into the room. Nonsense. If there is one thing my master taught me for certain, it is that there is always time for tea. The two cloaked men were left gaping, in Kisami's case quite literally, in the hallway as they watched the younger blonde move back into the hotel room. After a moment's pause, Kisame just shrugged, a somewhat bewildered expression on his face as he turned to his shorter companion. Actually, some tea sounds pretty good, not like we're on a time limit or something. Didn't Leader Sama say something about sealing the Kyuubi last anyway? When all he received was the silence of the hallway as an answer, he realized that Itachi had already moved past him into the room and was in the process of seating himself down on the couch opposite the blonde, a small wooden table between them. Hey, that was rude, Itachi. The dark-haired Uchiha ignored his partner as the larger man walked into the room, throwing himself back onto the couch beside him and grabbing one of the steaming cups laid out, almost as if the blonde had been expecting company. Hey Gaki, where's that cute girl you were walking around with earlier? The blue-skinned shinobi was looking around the hotel room, noticing the obvious lack of anybody else. Oh, she's about somewhere. Neither men reacted visibly to the vague comment but were still a little unnerved with the ease with which Naruto could shrug off their oppressive chakra combined. Finally, after Naruto had poured 2 more cups for himself and Itachi, he looked up, a bright smile on his face. So what can I help you with? Finally, unable to take the absurdity of the situation anymore, Kisame burst out laughing, filling the quiet room with his chuckles as he nudged his partner with his elbow. Man Itachi, can you imagine how easy this whole thing's gonna be if all the Jinchuriki are as helpful as the Gaki here? Distracted by his partner's obnoxious laughter, Itachi missed the slight hardening of Naruto's eyes, which the blonde quickly quashed. Now what could you two want with the Jinchuriki? Naruto's voice held sincere curiosity as he gazed calmly at the 2 nin over his steaming cup, blowing on it causally. That is unimportant, Naruto-kun. All you need to know is that you will be coming with us, one way or the other. Far from the defensive or hostile look Itachi had been expecting from the Kyuubi vessel, Naruto only gained a slight hint of mirth to his body language. For the first time, Itachi seemed to notice that Naruto seemed to be actively squinting his eyes for some reason, as if trying to hide his eyes from them. Could I ask where? Itachi of Konoha and Kisame of Kiri. Or should that be formerly? Again the boy spoke with a surprising nonchalance as he sipped at his tea. For 2's ranked and highly feared missing nin, it was very, very strange. You know of us. Kisame seemed amused and it showed through his voice. He found this entire situation just hilarious. In the end it meant very little to him just how they caught the Jinchuriki. It was going to end the same anyway, with them slung over Samahata like a bindle on a stick. Of course, few from Konoha don't know of the prodigy Itachi Uchiha, Genin at 7, Chunin at 10, Anbu captain at 13, flawless mission record and slaughterer of his clan. The young monk spoke the entire list of achievements like they were all positives before turning to Kisame. I also had the privilege of traveling through Mizu no Kuni for some time. I heard a lot about Kisame Hoshigake. Monster of the mist and wielder of the legendary blade Samahata. It was true, however his name was usually whispered in hushed tones like he was some kind of bogeyman. He was a truly feared figure in Kiri. A small smirk tugged at the edges of Naruto's lips as he met the former Kiri shinobi's beady eyes. I actually find your other nickname the most amusing, the tailless-tailed beast. He chuckled absently as he took another sip of his drink, something Chukaku had once told him enabled the old head monk to take control and set the pace of any conversation. You know, I know somebody who would be very disgruntled with you having that name, insulted even. Kisame only returned the smirk as he leant forward, a challenging look entering his eyes. Oh really? Who? Naruto only smiled as he took another long sip of his drink, choosing not to answer. As hospitable as you have been, Naruto-kun, I must insist that you come with us now. Naruto glanced over at the previously quiet Uchiha, noticing with some amusement that the dark-haired man had completely emptied his cup. Now, no need to be hasty, maybe you could answer a few questions of mine before we go, it's only fair after all. Itachi paused, narrowing his eyes at the blonde before being rudely elbowed in the side by his partner. Ah, go on Itachi, humor the kid, he's kind of grown on me and it's not like it'll matter in the end. Itachi thought about glaring at his partner but thought better of it. it wasn't like it would affect the chakra powerhouse much anyway. Fine, what would you like to know? Naruto smiled congenially as he finally set his cup down, sighing in contentment at the pleasant taste still lingering on his tongue. What does your organization want with the Biju? Kisame chuckled again at the blunt question that was offered up so casually it was like Naruto was talking about the weather while Itachi's gaze only narrowed further. What makes you suspect we are part of a group? Naruto only tilted his head innocently. The blonde thought about messing with the two further and playing the fool but figured answers were more important than the amusement. The matching cloaks and the gold that would require far more resources than two missing nins such as yourselves would be able to muster, even as powerful as you are. Itachi absorbed the observation before nodding once concedingly. You are far shrewder than I had thought you would be. Naruto leaned forward at that, unknowingly mirroring how Kisame had appeared earlier as an amused smile appeared on his features. Oh, how did you expect me to be? Like my younger self, full of energy and naivety shouting out an empty promise over a far-fetched dream. The blonde looked up at that seemingly in thought before chuckling himself, making Itachi realize that had they not been on opposite sides of this conflict he and Kisame would have probably gotten along. I suppose you would only be half right then, but in any case back to my question. Itachi noticed the change in the boy's posture as he said that, sitting up straighter and more alert. Our goal is peace. There was silence in the room as Naruto mulled over his words. His face becoming indecipherable in an unknowingly perfect replication of Fu's stoic facade. And you would use the Biju to achieve this? Itachi nodded again, noting that Kisame seemed to be getting more agitated now as the conversation became less amusing and interesting for him. Naruto simply sat in silence again, thinking over what the older Uchiha had told him before nodding once. Then I think that's all I need to know, thank you. And with that, without so much as a goodbye or any kind of warning, the blonde burst into a cloud of smoke, widening Itachi and Kisame's eyes. A shadow clone. Kisame had a particularly annoyed expression on his face as he swiped away the smoke from his face, coughing slightly thanks to the enclosed space they were in. That tricky brat, why didn't you see that, Itachi? The Uchiha merely gazed at the spot Naruto was sitting in, or at least his clone had, with an impassive expression. The shadow clone had identical chakra to the original, this one gave no sign that he was a clone. Can you still track him? Kisame shook his head. The blonde was already out of range of them and Samahata hadn't bothered to look while they were talking, thinking the target was right in front of them. Then we must go inform Leader Sama of this, he needs to know the Kyuubi Jinchuriki has resurfaced. Kisame just grunted as he stood up, disgruntled at not being able to have his fun after all. Shame that we couldn't even get a read on his skills though, would have been useful for the next time we ran into the Gaki. Itachi shook his head slowly as they left the hotel room, walking out into the now much quieter night air. On the contrary, even through his clone I was able to tell Naruto-kun had incredible reserves, much larger than your own. That made Kisame raise an eyebrow until Samahata's clicking on his back confirmed Itachi's observation. The sentient sword seemed extra excited about the monk's chakra for some reason. There was something else too. I was only able to briefly glimpse him with my Sharingan, but any genjutsu I tried to cast. It was almost as if he didn't notice they were there. Kisame shrugged, the huge sword on his back shifting with the movement. That's good, right? Itachi shook his head again, a disturbed look marring his normally stoic features. No, it was more like the genjutsu had no affect on him whatsoever. For somebody who specialized in illusions and subterfuge like Itachi, that was a frightening prospect to face in an enemy. But that isn't the most interesting thing. That made Kisame raise an eyebrow as he turned to his partner. Oh. Itachi still had that disturbed look on his face. If what he thought was true, then the consequences for their mission and their goal were staggering. The chakra flow to his eyes was strange, almost like my own. Kisame's eyes widened, knowing precisely what that meant. The brat has a dujutsu. Itachi nodded slowly. It was only conjecture, but still. Yes, however, the way the chakra moved, so steadily and constantly in such great amounts. Another frown marred his pale features. I have only ever seen it in one other person. Kisame seemed excited again, the mystery surrounding their target intriguing him. Who? That was when Itachi seemed most troubled, looking at the ground in silence as if searching for some other possible answer. Leader Sama. Chapter 64, Clouds Part 2. What a man's mind. can create, man's character can control. Thomas A. Edison. For the third time in his life Naruto found himself walking through the quiet and misty fog of Mizu no Kuni. The frigid, wet air clung to his body and clothes like a second skin in a familiar and uncomfortable film. He wouldn't say it out loud, but he knew that even as much as he had allowed himself to get over Shizuku's death, being here, in the country where he saw her die, made him melancholic. He deftly moved around the various roots and plants that might have tripped him up as he walked through the forest, lost in his own thoughts until a voice cut into his peace. "So kid, what's your business with Utakata anyway?" Naruto watched the taller, brawnier man that until now had seen fit to simply walk behind him in silence, comfortable in the presence of an entire squad of Kiri Anbu. "I came to warn him of a group hunting the Jinchuriki." The man, Naruto had been informed his name was Tsurugi, grunted before returning to an uneasy silence. The blonde found it a little strange that throughout his entire time working and fighting with the rebels he had never once met this man. He was now the commander of the Anbu in Kiri, working directly under Ao himself. He guessed it was because while Naruto had been protecting supplies this man had been behind enemy lines, sabotaging and assassinating. The reason they were now walking through a small forest near the south of Mizu no Kuni was simple. There had been a lot of sightings of a tall, thin man using strange bubble-oriented ninjutsu in the area. After finding out that there was a group actually hunting the Jinchuriki, Naruto had felt he should at least warn his fellow containers. They had been dealt a hard hand in life already and they did not need any more suffering from this group, whoever they were. However, considering the fact that most of the Jinchuriki were actually no longer such and Naruto knew Kurabi was very strong, he felt the Rokubi Jinchuriki was the first he should warn. Unfortunately he had no idea who that was or where they could be. He just considered himself lucky that he had a personal fount of knowledge named Fu traveling with him, or they wouldn't have even gotten this far. Unfortunately the mint-haired girl didn't know exactly who the Jinchuriki was. That information was kept strictly secret by the villages, but she knew at least that Kiri was the last person in possession of the creature. Her carers had wanted her prepared in the event a major village ever decided to attack Tokigakure and brought the force of their own Jinchuriki to play. From there it had been a matter of traveling to Kurigakure, constantly keeping watch for any sign that Kisame or Itachi, or anybody else wearing that black cloak with red clouds, was following them. May had been surprisingly helpful for them as it turned out that they weren't the only one searching for the Rokubi Jinchuriki, a man named Utakata. In fact, it was currently an Anbu directive to look out for anyone bearing his description, thus the reason Naruto and his friends were currently traveling with an entire squad of them. May had been hoping that with the loss of the Sanbi with Yagura's death, Kiri could recoup some of their lost power with their other Jinchuriki. She had hoped that once word reached the elusive man that the rebellion was over he would come back to them, no longer having to fear the hunter nin after him. However, when no such thing happened after a year, she had begun to actively search him out. Unfortunately for them, years of evading and being chased by Yagura's hunter nin hadn't exactly made Utakata all that respondent to Kiri Shinobi, it had also made him exceptionally difficult to find. "I still don't understand why a brat like you was assigned to this mission. You aren't even a shinobi. It's insulting that an entire squad of Anbu is having to play babysitter to a bunch of teens, barely older than 16. From the rear of the group Yuya flipped the man the bird as she walked, having been idly complaining about the moisture in the air making her usually straight hair frizz out. It was an uncharacteristically un-kunoichi thing for her to say, but she had little else to talk about. An annoying haiku with pointless chatter was like a hobby for her. "I'm 18, you asshole." Tsurugi just grumbled to himself, rubbing the scar that passed downwards through his left eye absently. "I don't care if you're 30, you aren't Kurigakure shinobi." Naruto chuckled slightly, turning and pointing the Anbu that had thought he was well hidden in the trees to their right. "He has a fire affinity." Tsurugi blinked as he looked up at where Naruto was pointing, easily picking out his squad member on a high branch that seemed a little shocked he had been found out so easily. However, Naruto didn't wait for a response from the grizzled Anbu commander, flicking his hand out again and pointing to another seemingly empty space to their left. "Water affinity with a small secondary affinity to lightning." At that, Tsurugi raised an eyebrow, but it seemed Naruto wasn't finished as he wheeled again, pointing 3 times in quick succession. "Earth and water, earth, and another water affinity, a strong one." Tsurugi quickly verified that there were indeed Anbu stationed where Naruto had been pointing before raising an eyebrow. So you're a censor. He already knew that the boy had been correct in his assertions. Tsurugi prided himself on knowing his Anbu intimately, abilities and affinities included. However, the ability to not only sense people, but the nature of the chakra too was a rare ability indeed. It suddenly made sense to him why Naruto had been placed with him. For a sensor of his ability, it would be easy to pick out a Jinchuriki if they got close enough. It was hard to escape a sensor on your trail, harder still when they were backed up by an entire squad of Anbu. That doesn't really help us find Utakata though. Naruto just smirked at that, pointing off in another random direction after briefly closing his eyes in concentration. Tsurugi was almost about to scoff seeing as there was no Anbu in the direction he was pointing, but Naruto beat him to it. About 2 kilometers that way is a small camp of Anbu Black Ops, 5 men and a woman, 3 are sleeping while the others are awake and forming a perimeter. This time Tsurugi's frown was more pronounced. He knew for a fact that information was correct. He had issued orders to such a squad this morning. So you're a powerful censor. Tsurugi scrutinized the young blonde for a moment. His abilities as a censor sounded suspiciously similar to what Yagura had been known for. Tsurugi would know too, as he had still been an Anbu captain before the rebellion had broken out, and he knew a lot about the former Mizukage. What's your range? Naruto looked up for a moment, trying to recall the furthest he had ever tried to stretch out his water sensing without giving himself a bad headache. Around 3 kilometers if I stand still, but it gets blurry after 2 kilometers and all I get is the chakra signatures themselves. Tsurugi raised an eyebrow at the all, but said nothing as the group continued on. Even with the addition of a powerful sensory type, he didn't fancy their chances too much. Utakata had been on the run far too long and hid himself far too well for him to be caught by anything less than a powerful S-ranked shinobi. In a small fishing village on the southernmost peninsula of the main island of Mizu no Kuni, a man sat on a cliff, overlooking the sea. In the distance he could spot another small island shrouded in early morning fog and was gazing at it disinterestedly. A small bubble flew up from the oddly shaped pipe he had held against his mouth, and anybody sensitive to that sort of thing would have noticed it, and the fluid it held were saturated with a potent chakra. He watched the shiny sphere with a bit of curiosity for a moment to see which way the wind would take it, only seeing his warped and discolored features in the filmy bubble. He was a thin man with his light blue kimono-like robe hanging loosely around his lithe body, exposing his bare chest and dragging around his feet when he stood. His dark hair fell limply over one board, listless eye as the other continued to lazily watch the bubble as it finally popped into little splashes of liquid. Other than that, the man seemed rather unremarkable, just a mildly odd vagrant that always seemed to travel from place to place with no real purpose or destination. Huh, well, you finally found me. I suppose it was only a matter of time in the end. The crunch of gravel behind him gave away his pursuers' presences, not to mention the man could feel the immense chakra they had. He stood up languidly, keeping his pipe on hand just in case as he turned to the people behind him, raising his eyebrow at their appearance. Huh, it's strange for the Mizukage to use shinobi outside of the Kiri forces, after all blonde is an uncommon hair color in this country. He frowned as the people before him stayed quiet, his hand twitching around his pipe reflexively. The Mizukage sent you to take me back, right? The man in front of him grinned in response, reaching into his cloak with both hands in an action that put Utakata on edge. Oh no, I just wanted to show you something, The thin Jinchuriki raised an eyebrow as he tensed his body. This wasn't what he had been expecting. What? The man seemed to grin as he relished the question, his hand re-emerging from his cloak, seemingly empty. My art. Okay, now I'm officially bored. Tayuya groaned loudly as she flopped back on the large boulder she had been resting on, absently blowing a large tuft of hair away from her face. The 4 of them were stood in a small clearing outside a town where they had received reports of a man matching Utakata's description. Tsurugi and his Anbu had gone ahead to check it out, telling the civilians to stay where they were and not interfere with Kiri's operation. It was rather rude of him to simply leave us here. We could have at least gone into the village. Naruto raised an eyebrow from where he was comfortably sat against the thick trunk of a tree. It was rare to hear Tayuya and Haku agree over anything so easily. It makes sense, we wouldn't want to overwhelm him with a load of people he doesn't know. We just want to talk after all, not scare him off. Tayuya just groaned pathetically again as she gently banged her head against the rock repeatedly in a show of frustration. Yeah, but then why's he taken that entire Anbu squad with him? Naruto simply responded by suddenly vanishing from view, becoming invisible almost instantly. Because if they do their jobs, Utakata will never even see them. Yuya simply snorted at that as Naruto faded back into the visible spectrum like he had appeared from some other dimension. Yeah, sounds about right, offer to talk openly but have a few hidden knives poised to strike when they say no. The blonde did sigh at that. It was the unfortunate truth of the shinobi world, trust only went as far as you could reach with your blade. It shouldn't come to that, but all we need to do is deliver a warning. Whether or not Utakata heeds it or accepts Kurigaku's offer is up to him. Yuya chuckled derisively again as she leaned back up in a lazy flopping motion that had her long hair whipping about her face again. Naruto never understood why she didn't cut it, but he had to admit that long red hair appealed to him somewhat, although he couldn't explain why. Hey, what's really the point though? These Red Cloud guys want to get all the Jinchuriki right. That means they're after the Biju, but you're the container for 6 of them, so they have to get you first. The redhead snorted into her hand with an amused smirk. Honestly, it makes me feel a little sorry for them. I know how powerful you are. Naruto smiled a little at the rare compliment from the volatile girl before frowning. It doesn't matter if this group's goal is successful or not. I made a promise to the Biju that I would help them find their peace, all of them. If they wish to use the Biju's power, taking it by force for whatever plan they have in mind, then naturally we will come into conflict. But if I can keep the 2 remaining Jinchuriki out of it, then I will, for the sake of their Biju. Yuya blinked once at the sheer determination behind Naruto's words before sighing and offering a tired smirk. Hey, if this whole world peace thing of yours doesn't work out, you should go into public speaking, or maybe therapy. You'd help a lot of those whiny fuckers with their pansy problems. Naruto just grinned back at her. He could always count on his foul-mouthed friend to make light of almost any situation. Anyway, however, Yuya was cut off as Naruto raised a hand at the exact moment they were joined in the clearing by the Anbu squad and Tsurugi, his white porcelain mask with 2 tiger stripe-like red marks covering his face. Hey, took you long enough, asshole, we've been waiting here for. However, once again she was cut off by Naruto as he held a hand up. She was about to round on him for it before noticing the steely look in his eye as he stared at Tsurugi. Don't bother, Yuya, these aren't the Anbu, they're fakes. He turned to a seemingly random part of the clearing, his eyes becoming narrower and deathly serious. Isn't that right? The group, not having sensed anything or anybody approaching except the Anbu, weren't prepared as something jumped out of the darkness offered by the trees. It might have been a man, but he was horribly hunched over and the majority of his body was covered in a very recognizable black cloak with red puffy clouds. Not exactly, these are the very same Anbu, I merely improved them. The voice was deep and gravely, almost distorted as if it did not properly belong to the owner. But to be found out so easily when I went to the trouble of masking the changes is interesting. It seemed Itachi was right when he informed us not to underestimate you, Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Naruto narrowed his eyes, slowly putting the pieces together from the man-thing's words and what he could see of the Anbu, standing there motionlessly. What did you do to them? It was odd, like Gaara he now saw a thin film of chakra covering each of the Anbu, preventing him from seeing anything inside them. Not only that, but there was a thin string of chakra emerging from various parts of their bodies, all connected to the man-thing who was similarly covered in a layer of chakra. They were almost like the strings of a puppet. Like I said, I improved them, made them eternal, allowed their visage to last forever. They are not as perfect as my usual works, but I am at least proud of them considering the minimal time and effort I placed into each. As one, the Anbu operatives removed their masks, making all 4 teens widen their eyes in horror and amazement save Naruto, who was now beginning to visibly tremble with suppressed rage. Each man and woman now bore an eternal, sickening grin, parts of their face interlocking like life-sized puppets. Their eyes were permanently wide and glassy, locked forever on a creepy, unblinking stare. You would defile their bodies in such a way. His thoughts were thrown back to Orochimaru, how he raised Shizuku simply to use her as psychological warfare on him. You know nothing, boy, do you defile a canvas when you fill its frame with priceless art? I give these men a taste of immortality, an art that lasts the test of time, and you call it defilement. You are merely an ignorant child. However, you needn't worry. I am not here for you, Kyuubi Jinchuriki. You need only be delayed while my foolish partner deals with the Rokubi. Naruto calmed the shaking in his hands, now clenched into tight fists that had his knuckles turning white. To Yuya, Haku, Fu, I need you to go and help Utakata. He knew they would be fine. With luck Fu would recognize the man's partner, giving them a much easier fight. It would take an extremely powerful opponent to defeat all three of them at once, especially with another Jinchuriki with them. Fu seemed about to object, but she hesitated as she noticed the cold stare he was giving the man-thing controlling the former Anbu. A small part of her thought this was how he must have appeared facing down Yagura, and the thought almost frightened her. Back then Naruto had killed a Jinchuriki Kage thanks to his rage. That was 3 years ago, and the thought of what he could do now, if he truly released himself, was honestly terrifying. Right. In an instant the three dashed off towards the village. However, it seemed the puppeteer had other ideas as the chakra threads twitched. What makes you think I will allow you to leave? 5 of the Anbu puppets immediately moved to intercept the 3 teens who looked about ready to turn and counter. However, the need never arose, as almost immediately the ground around them burst into sand that reached up with a mind of its own to wrap around the puppets and crush them without a second thought. It pained Naruto to so indifferently crush the former Kiri shinobi, however considering what they had become it seemed like a mercy to them. Whatever the case, it worked and the 3 teens had the time to escape, dashing off into the trees. That was foolish of you, boy. Do you really think you can face a shinobi of my caliber by yourself? Naruto didn't give the reaction the man was expecting as the trembling in his hands stopped, a smile spreading over his face. I don't need to defeat you. I only need to delay you until my friends deal with your partner. The puppeteer remained unmoved, although it may have had to do with the strip of black cloth hanging in front of his mouth. So you think I will merely stand here as we wait for either of our companions to deal with the other? Do you really have such confidence in those mere teens to deal with an S-ranked shinobi like myself? Naruto's smile grew a little as the 2 powerful men stood opposite one another, neither making a move to initiate a fight. I do. His response was a small grunt from the man as Naruto began to see the chakra threads connected to the remaining Anbu puppets, Tsurugi included, move and ride like thin, glowing snakes. I'm afraid I will have to disappoint you then. I despise the thought of merely waiting for my foolish partner, knowing him he will make some grand gesture and idiotic speech and that will keep me waiting. The man's bloodshot and cruel eyes narrowed as the patterns of the chakra thread movement became more complex. I hate to be kept waiting. The chakra threads suddenly moved in a strange, ethereal dance that Naruto had to admit was incredibly impressive as the puppet Anbu suddenly leapt forward. Without so much as a hand gesture, sand once again came to Naruto's call as it leapt from the ground, aiming to ensnare the transformed shinobi. However, the puppeteer seemed more than prepared this time as 2 of the puppets suddenly appeared in front of the others, their sickening grins snapping open as a tube embedded in their throats released a filmy, almost translucent spray. As soon as the gaseous substance that Naruto could see was lightly interspersed with chakra made contact with the sand, he felt his ability to control it suddenly taken away. It was like each individual sand grain was suddenly sticking to the ones next to it, bonding the entire cloud together and rendering Naruto's ability to manipulate it null. Do you like it? I had originally intended to use that aerosol adhesive against the Ikibi Jinchuriki when he was located, however considering you seem to share his abilities, an oddity I must say by the way, it will suffice. Naruto blinked in surprise at how easily this man had rendered one of his most powerful abilities completely void. He didn't get a lot of time to think on it though, as the remaining puppets darted around the frozen cut of sand. They hovered along the ground at frightening speed as the puppeteer expertly controlled them, as if gravity held no sway over their bodies. Naruto saw fit to remind them they were not exempt from gravity's influence as he raised a single hand. Shinra Tensai. The puppeteer's eyes only had time to marginally widen at the name of the technique before 4 of the 5 puppets suddenly met an invisible wall of force. There was too little time for the man-thing to withdraw them before they were all sent flying back, smashing into the trees and ground in sprays of broken wood, thankfully. Naruto wasn't sure if he would have been okay had the bodies had still been of flesh and blood. In the Nuke Nin's shock, Naruto was able to drop a long, sturdy black rod from his sleeve, grab it and suddenly throw it all in one smooth motion. The chakra rod flew true and impaled the last remaining puppet through what would have been its heart had the organ not been coldly ripped out to be replaced by machinery and seals. The rod itself only lodged halfway into the sturdy wood, or whatever material these abominations were made from, but it was enough. The chakra-disrupting effect of the rod immediately kicked in, letting the puppet slump limply to the ground as the puppeteer lost his ability to control it. The entire encounter had happened in less than a few seconds, but already both opponents had learned a great deal about the other. Remarkable. Naruto turned to see the puppeteer gazing at him with curious, glassy eyes that stared at him unblinkingly like he was some piece of complex machinery he needed to figure out. So you do possess the Rinnegan, that is truly fascinating. That rang alarm bells in Naruto's mind. This man could not have seen his eyes yet, and he didn't remember showing during his conversation with Itachi or Kisame. How could he possibly recognize what should have been an extinct Dujutsu purely from the skills he had displayed? Incredible, you will be my greatest masterpiece, a puppet like no other as I wield the power of the Sage of the Six Paths at my fingertips. I can promise you that once Akatsuki is done with your body, only the utmost time and care will go into reforming you into the perfect work of art. Naruto grimaced at that, glancing around to make absolutely sure that all of the puppets were irreparably broken. Should I feel honored by that? He took the lack of response from the man to mean he was planning his next move, meaning he should be wary. So Akatsuki, that is the name of the organization hunting the Biju. That at least explains the clouds. But I feel a more personal name would be apt in this situation. If you like, I'll start. He inclined his head in a mockery of politeness as the puppeteer continued to watch him coldly. Naruto Uzumaki, Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi no Kitsune at your service, but I assume you already knew that. The man-thing's head tilted slightly almost in a show of amusement, but was gone as soon as it appeared. I suppose it is only apt that you know the name of the artist that will turn you into the finest work of art ever seen. I am Sasori no Akasuna, former shinobi of Sunagaku no Sato. Naruto struggled to put a face to that name for a moment, but nothing came to mind. Fu was the walking shinobi encyclopedia, not him. However, the fact he was from Sunagaku at least confirmed he was definitely a puppeteer, a dangerous art if wielded by a skilled practitioner. You won't get that far. Despite the man's features not changing at all, Naruto could feel his mocking smile from beneath that thin strip of cloth. We'll see. It came so suddenly Naruto didn't even manage to bring his hand up all the way. It was pure luck that none of the myriad of Senbon that suddenly came shooting from Sasori's mouth didn't hit him. It was like they were all spring-loaded inside the puppeteer's body. He was just fortunate that the Shinra Tensei he did fire off managed to divert enough of the lethal metal needles so that they in turn threw the others off course. However, in Naruto's confusion, Sasori wasn't sitting idle, as he quickly proved. I'm afraid you are 20 years too early to be challenging me, boy. I will show you the difference in our ability. Through the cloud of smoke that had been kicked up by both of their techniques, a thin, tail-like metal blade suddenly sliced through the air, aiming to impale Naruto through the middle. Naruto managed to throw up an arm to counter it by batting it away by the flat side of the blade, but almost as soon as he did, it twisted around like it was a true tail, slicing back around to bisect him down the middle. He dived backward, throwing up a wall of sand to cover his escape. However, the razor-sharp tail cut through the earth wall like it was barely there. Come now, make this all at least worthwhile. Show me something so I don't get tired of waiting for you to fall. I would like to know the abilities of my next puppet before I have to strip you open. Naruto grimaced again as the cloud of smoke finally dissipated, revealing Sasori to still just be standing, or maybe crouching, there with the metal tail-like appendage swaying slowly behind him like his namesake would suggest. He looked down at his fingers, noticing a slight purple film over them from where he had touched the tail blade. Poison. Also, you noticed? Yes, that's a particularly nasty blend of mine. Still experimental, but I'm sure you will be happy to test it out for me. Naruto wiped off the dangerous liquid on his robes before looking up, widening his eyes when he realized Sasori's tail was nowhere to be seen. Just in time too, as it burst out from the ground behind him, slicing through the air with an audible whine. Sasori just grunted when it met resistance, just not the type he had been expecting. From Naruto's back, from beneath his robes, emerged a blade very similar to Sasori's own, however his was serrated and not dripping with deadly debilitating poison. Fascinating, you already display certain characteristics of a puppet. Opening you up and finding out your every secret will be just fascinating. Naruto for his part seemed just as surprised as his apparent tail blade fended off Sasori's. the gleaming metal of each sparking as the smooth blade of the puppeteer failed to gain any ground on Naruto's serrated one. Finally Sasori's retreated before Naruto had time to recoup and consider something else while the man's main method of attack was occupied. Almost instantly Naruto's blade retracted, taking the cold sensation with it as it merged back into normal flesh. Naruto may have felt discomforted by the alienating feeling of the Asura path, but he couldn't deny its versatility. I already told you, you won't get the chance. Again Naruto could feel the calculating, bloodshot eyes observing him coldly. I have yet to see anything that would suggest that. Naruto didn't give him a chance to do anything though as he preemptively raised both of his hands. Shinra Tensai. He almost breathed a sigh of relief as he saw the gravitational blast hit Sasori dead on with nothing coming out to block it or try to divert it. However, he was shocked when Sasori barely moved at all. What did happen though was his cloak had been blown off, revealing the horrific figure underneath. It appeared to be a large, dark-skinned man with his hair pulled into dreadlocks, crouched down on all fours. However, his skin was unnaturally shiny and smooth while his joints were segmented. A puppet. The jointed mouth of the thing moved in a mockery of human speech as it shifted into a cruel smirk. Yes, Hiriko, one of my favorites. It eliminates the problem all puppeteers face when it comes to defending themselves. Instead of hiding behind my puppets like most do, I hide inside them instead. Ingenious, no? The more calculating side of Naruto was slightly impressed at the idea, however the human part of him was disgusted. This man was hiding inside what used to be a human. And now he could see the thing. He realized why his Diva Path's attack had no effect. Spikes had emerged from its feet and hand, locking it place on the ground. You have to understand, Kyuubi Jinchuriki, I am a puppeteer. While other shinobi train, we instead prepare. The more a puppeteer prepares for every possible outcome, the better they are. The sickening human puppet crouched down lower as the blade, which was now revealed to emerge from the mouth of some twisted Hania mask on its back, swayed entrancingly. And I am the best puppet master in the world. Naruto found himself grimacing internally once again. It seemed none of his tricks or abilities would work a second time on this man. Luckily he had a lot of them. Your hubris will be your downfall. Naruto raised a hand again and immediately the spikes dug into the ground in preparation for a Shinra Tensai. However, the gravitation attack never came. Instead, the puppet was unprepared for when Naruto suddenly closed his hand, straining under the massive influx of chakra running through the limb. Kenkyona Jibun. The previously flexible metal tail that hung threateningly over Hiriko suddenly fell as its weight had been quadrupled, which effectively it had. The puppet itself collapsed to the ground, the joints unable to hold up its own weight as the material it was made from began to buckle inwards. It would seem Sasori wasn't defeated though, as the Hiriko puppet suddenly exploded outward, scattering hundreds upon hundreds of deadly, poison-laced Senbon in every possible direction with enough momentum to escape the increased gravitational field. Naruto's eyes widened as he opened his hand again, bringing up his other just in time for the dangerous needles to harmless bounce off an invisible wall of force. Sasori used the release to dash away from the broken remains of his puppet, landing high above Naruto on a tree, Akatsuki cloak fluttering in the breeze. Impressive, Kyuubi Jinchuriki. The ability to manipulate the very forces of gravity itself is a dangerous one that I will put to good use in the future. However, the real fight begins now. Chapter 65, Clouds Part 3. After the game, the king and the pawn go in the same box. Proverb. Fu masked her confusion well as she ran across the tiled roofs of the small fishing village. It was a comparatively small place when compared to a large city-like village such as Konoha, but it was still a big place, especially to find someone in. However, she had been expecting the signs of a fight. After all, Jinchuriki fights were rarely contained to one place and the damage was never minimal. Earlier, as they had raced through the trees, she had felt a large blast of potent Biju chakra, more than she had ever felt than ever before. Even from herself, meaning Utakata had for some reason gone into a full, six-tailed Biju state. However, there was no sign of that now. In fact, the air was still and calm, too calm. Nobody would have been prepared for when the tiles beneath their feet suddenly turned white, giving Fu and the others only moments to jump away on instinct alone before they exploded into a massive conflagration of heat and flame. However, the mint-haired Jinchuriki found that as soon as she touched down on the adjacent roof, the exact same thing happened. rendering her off balance and overwhelmed as she jumped from rooftop to rooftop, having them all explode after her. Finally she ran out of space and was forced to jump high into the air to avoid a final, much larger blast that she was caught on the edge of, sending her flying through the air uncontrollably. She impacted roughly with the ground, creating a small trench through the loose soil with her body before rolling to a stop. She picked herself up slowly, orange eyes darting about in preparation for another ambush. However, she only saw Haku, racing down the street towards her. His kimono was a little singed, but otherwise he looked okay as he skidded to a stop next to her. "Fu, you're okay. What was that back there? I lost track of Tayuya in the blast." Fu's eyes continued to dart about as she tried to find the location of their attacker. Luckily she didn't have to search too far before she spotted a smirking blonde man standing atop a nearby building, red clouds decorating his black cloak. "Ah, you survived. Sasori Dana's not going to be pleased if I keep him too long. Couldn't you just succumb to my art like good little kids, Fu loosened off her shoulders, trying to analyze what she knew about this man to find a name. She recognized the style as Explosion Release, a very rare Keke Genkai from Iwagakure, however his headband was slashed. She didn't remember there being a missing nin of his description before she ran away with Naruto. Her information was becoming more and more out of date. She really needed to get her hands on a current bingo book. "Haku, this man uses explosions. The villagers here will be at risk, so try to find Tayuya if you can and get them to safety. I will draw him away from this place if I can." Haku hesitated for a moment as he was loath to leave his friend to face such an obviously powerful opponent, however the tone in her voice gave him pause. He had heard that same tone before, from Naruto. It spoke of confidence and resolve and one just couldn't argue against it. Right. With that the last Yuki dashed off to find their wayward redhead while Fu turned her full attention on the former Iwa bomber who was looking at her amusedly, hands stuck into his cloak. It gave her a little more time to analyze him for any exploitable weaknesses. A long blonde bang hung down over one eye, but it didn't appear to hinder his sight, and anything else was concealed beneath the bulky, shapeless cloak. "Oh, you'll lead me away, huh?" The man grinned as the sound of large flapping wings appeared behind him just as an enormous white bird that appeared to be made of clay of some sort ascended behind him. "How are you going to do that if you can't even reach me?" The blonde bomber jumped backwards onto the bird's back, landing in a three-point stance before languidly straightening up. Fu's eyes widened when she realized a limp form is being carried in the doughy tail of the bird, no doubt the Rokubi Jinchuriki, Utakata. "So all I have to do is catch you." Fu's voice was calm and level as she gazed up at the now airborne bomber, just the smallest hints of amusement slipping through her stoic facade. In an instant two large, insectoid wings seemed to unfurl as if out of thin air from her back, each a brilliant yellow that gradiated to red towards the tips. Far from the extensions of her chakra cloak that they were before, these wings seemed real, as if they had always been a part of Fu. She proved just how real they were as she began to lift off the ground, wings beating furiously behind her in an orange blur of motion. The bomber was grinning as he flew off to help his partner wrap up with the Kyuubi Jinchuriki so they could make a quick getaway with the Rokubi. It was only reflex honed from hundreds of battles and intense training that told him to bank swiftly to the left, narrowly missing the spinning blur that rocketed past him like a human bullet. The spinning object paused in the air, gracefully unraveling to reveal Fu, hovering there like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You may not leave, your opponent is me." However, far from the reaction she had been expecting, the Iwanuke Nin's grin only widened as the bird came to a likewise stop in mid-air, hovering there on powerful downward beats of its wings. Well, green hair, orange eyes, insect wings, so that's where the Nanabi container went, Sasori Dana will be pleased if we manage to bring back 2 Jinchuriki with us. He seemed to nod to himself as if deliberating something in his mind before grinning even further as he gazed up at Fu. "All right Nanabi, I'll face you. My name is Deidara. Remember it because it's my art that will be imprinted on your retinas in your very last moments, because true art is an explosion." Fu's eyes widened when she felt something behind her, her wings folding inwards on instinct to allow her to swiftly drop down. Katsu. It was just in time too as Deidara formed a half-tiger seal and the much smaller white clay birds that had been sneaking up behind Fu detonated into successive blasts of heat and flame. Fu was just out of their blast radius though, spinning out of her dive to soar back up towards Deidara, wings beating furiously as she darted left and right erratically like a dragonfly. However, the blonde bomber was prepared for her, hands re-emerging from his cloak as he threw out a few more of the little living sculptures. A puff of smoke later and they had enlarged into two medium-sized birds with 4 wings that immediately matched her speed as they rocketed towards her. Fu remained emotionless as she placed her own hands into the tiger's seal, sucking in a large breath before breathing out a huge cloud of bright, sparkling dust that she proceeded to fly straight into, blocking her and the explosive birds from Deidara's view. The bomber covered one eye and tried to spot her with the special device he had over his left eye, but it was useless. The dust cloud only reflected the light back at him, blinding him if he looked for too long. Katsu. In a last-ditch attempt to get her, Deidara simply detonated the clay birds within the cloud, the explosion managing to disperse the optical ninjutsu to reveal Fu had vanished. Deidara's eyes widened as he spun around, ducking in time to avoid a spinning axe kick that speed was maximized by the girl dropping hundreds of feet at him. Instead, her foot hit the bird he was standing on, time pausing for a moment as the momentum carried through the sculpture before the great bird went plummeting down to the ground. If it had been alive, its spine would have been instantly cracked by the insane maneuver. Deidara watched from his fall as Fu stayed hovering in the sky, staring dispassionately down at him. He hated that look. It was the same one Itachi always gave him, taunting him with their so-called superiority. He would show them. A slightly crazed grin erupted on his face as his hands once again came up into the half-tiger seal. Fu only had time to look down in shock and see the small white spiders that were suddenly covering her body, Deidara having planted them there when he ducked from her kick, before they detonated. The flash illuminated the sky even in the daylight, lighting up Deidara's manic grin. However, it was immediately replaced by a frown when no limp, scorched body fell from the smoke cloud. Confusion, then realization marred his features when the dust cleared to reveal a smaller white cloud of smoke at its center. "Hey, shadow clones, you're pretty good for a Jinchuriki." In another burst of smoke, another large bird appeared to catch him from his fall, allowing him to look around to try and spot his hidden opponent. He spotted her flying furiously away from him, the limp form of Utakata carried in her arms so that she could get him somewhere safe. Deidara nodded his head approvingly at his opponent's tactics as his bird raced after them, surprisingly fast for its size and the heavy material it was made from. "Well, Nanabe, you've been doing pretty well against my Shi-wan, but let's up the game a notch, How about my Shi-su?" As Fu continued to fly in the opposite direction of the mad bomber, her orange eyes widened when the color on the limp form of the Rokubi Jinchuriki began to fade into a familiar, doughy white. She immediately tried to drop the fake, but the sticky clay suddenly tried to engulf her, hardening around her body in an attempt to catch her mid-flight. Katsu. Deidara had to shield his eyes from the powerful explosion, grinning all the while. It had been a long time since he faced an opponent strong enough to warrant the use of the next step in his art. However, his grin slowly faded from his face as the smoke from the blast diffused into the air. Right at the center, where he was hoping to see at least a defeated, or at least battered and singed Fu, was a yellowy red cocoon formed by the girl's wings. It completely enveloped her body, protecting her from the blast even at such a close range. She didn't know anything stronger than the scales on the Nanabe's wings after all. Slowly it unfurled to reveal she now had 4 of the quickly beating extra appendages, each working in harmony to keep her aloft, making her seem even more like a dragonfly. She had to be careful now though, this was the limit of her control over the partial transformation. "No." Deidara growled as he pressed his hands together. For the first time Fu noticed with a small grimace of disgust that the man had hands in each of his palms, complete with teeth and tongues. Those mouths were now swapping the clay between them as they chewed it up before spitting it out in the visage of a miniature dragon. It didn't stay miniature for long though, as it expanded in a massive cloud of smoke with Deidara standing proudly on its head. "You haven't seen anything of my art yet." Fu did her best to ignore the seemingly mad ramblings of the bomber while keeping an eye on him as she scanned the surroundings for any sign of the missing Rokubi Jinchuriki. She spotted him in the slowly dissolving body of Deidara's original mount that she had kicked out of the sky. However, as soon as she spotted him, she noticed something off about his body. It was beginning to radiate Biju chakra at an alarming rate. Even from this distance she was able to see as the thin man's eyes snapped open, revealing them to be soulless and completely black. Even Deidara turned as the oppressive weight of the Rokubi's chakra fell on them full force. "Ah, Sasori-Dana's going to be annoyed with me, The last Senbon fell to the ground with a muted clink of metal on earth, creating a small pile of them just in front of Naruto, halted by some invisible border 2 meters out from his feet. Puppeteer and monk stared at one another. Naruto, no longer seeing the reason to hide his Rinnegan, allowed his ringed eyes to meet with Sasori's as the two stared the other down. How could you do that to yourself? Sasori's face remained impassive as he gazed at the blonde whose eyes met darting over his body disbelievingly. Oh, so you see it then. Naruto did. He saw everything with sickening detail. Just like with his other puppets, Sasori was coated by a thin film of chakra, hiding everything inside him. The man had turned himself into a puppet. Isn't it beautiful? An immortal, unaging body that doesn't feel pain and I can modify, improve and perfect at my leisure. A small smirk made its way onto the Tsunanuke Nin's face as he looked down, some of his red spiky hair falling across his eyes as he sighed in amusement. I'm afraid I lied to you. You see, you will not be my masterpiece. I have already constructed my masterpiece of puppetry, and it is me. Sasori cast his Akatsuki cloak aside, revealing his puppet body in all its glory. Had he not have had segmented joints and an unnaturally shiny luster to his skin, he probably would have been considered handsome in a Bishonen way. He looked to be around 16, although the body itself made determining his age impossible. There was some kind of coil embedded in his stomach that looked to be a thick metal rope wound around a spool, like some cheap mockery of intestines. However, Naruto knew this was no ordinary puppet. It was no trick to fool him into a false sense of security by a clever puppeteer. Where Sasori's heart would be was a strange cylindrical object embedded in his chest that's fleshy appearance clashed with the shiny aesthetic of the rest of his body. It was imprinted with the kanji for scorpion. However, its appearance meant little compared to what it represented. Naruto could see it all with his Rinnegan. It was the source of the man's chakra, an entire chakra circulatory system, down to the coils, compressed into a tiny space and used to power this abomination of a puppet. How many attempts did it take you to successfully compress down an entire chakra system? How many people did you kill on your path to this immortality? Sasori shrugged, allowing Naruto to see how the individual joints slid and moved about one another just as a real human body would do. While the practice itself was hideous, there was no denying the expert craftsmanship that actually went into this puppet body. Not just anyone could have made such a puppet. Unfortunately, progress is paved with little sacrifices, but the end result was well worth it. Naruto's hand clenched around his shakuju subconsciously. It's funny how many people there like you that are so accepting of sacrifice, as long as they aren't the one who actually sacrifice something. What you call sacrifice, I call making someone else suffer in your place. Sasori waved a hand at the blonde absently. That may be, but it's ultimately irrelevant. Now, how about I introduce you to a very special puppet of mine? He'll be the one you replace as the pride of my collection, but for now he will suffice. Sasori pulled out a scroll that was one of 4 mounted on his back, unfurling it to reveal a large kanji for third. Naruto was about to reach out and pull it to him with a Bansho tenon, but he was too late. In a puff of smoke, Sasori had managed to summon the puppet. Say hello to the Sandaime Kage of Sunagaku no Sato. Naruto's eyes widened at that. He might not have had the expansive knowledge of shinobi that Fu did, but even he knew the significance of Suna's supposedly most powerful Kage. His disappearance had instigated the Third Shinobi World War as Suna moved into Iwa's territory in attempts to find him, thinking it to be a kidnapping. Well, it seemed they were right. It just hadn't been Iwagakure who took him. I will show you why he was considered the most powerful Kage Suna has ever seen. The puppet itself seemed rather plain, wearing a ragged gray cloak that concealed much of its body with messy black hair and a regal, stoic face. The only thing indicating it was even a puppet was the fact its mouth seemed connected to the rest of its face via a segment. Suddenly that segmented mouth opened up far too much to ever be considered normal as it began to release copious amounts of tiny iron filings that quickly formed into a cloud in front of it. A compartment in its chest opened up, releasing a pulse of chakra that immediately had the iron sand jumping to the puppeteer's command. Jiden, Sutetsu Shigur. The iron sand suddenly whirled into a vaguely circular shield before the puppeteer and his minion before bulging out. Faster than most shinobi could react, the shield-like structure began firing off a multitude of small, bullet-like projectiles. Naruto found his hand instinctively rising to cast off the projectiles like normal, but he was suddenly halted, as if something was tying his arm down. When he looked down, he was shocked to see a small chakra thread connected to his wrist, preventing it from moving. He frowned at the attempt to prevent his defense before his eyes pulsed with chakra, halting the potentially lethal and no doubt poisoned sand in its tracks as it met an invisible barrier of gravitational force surrounding his entire body. As quickly as it stopped, the sand, every last grain, was blasted back, scattering it in all directions throughout the clearing like shrapnel from a bomb with Naruto at its epicenter. Sasori was unconcerned though as the Kage quickly moved in front of him, halting the sand again as it was brought back under the puppet's magnetic influence. With every technique, every move, my fascination with you grows more and more. Come, show me just what those eyes are capable of. Naruto took a deep calming breath before raising a hand up, intent on finishing this encounter swiftly so he could go and help his friends. He trusted them, but if Sasori's partner was just as powerful as he was, then a confrontation might end with casualties. Bansho Tenin, the Kage puppet suddenly twitched as Sasori frowned, fingers moving in a blur as the cage was suddenly pulled in two opposite directions. Sasori kept it tethered against the increasing gravitational forces via the chakra threads all across its body. However, as strong as they were no match for a primal force of the universe, and he felt his control slip every second. Instead of struggling though, Sasori simply allowed the puppet to be pulled in, both of its arms suddenly producing long and vicious-looking scythe blades, dripping with poison. Naruto didn't let them touch him though, as with his other hand he brought his shakuju up, twirling it once before mercilessly slamming it into the puppet's chest. The Kage tried to defend itself by slicing the supposedly wooden staff into thirds, however it wasn't expecting the blades to simply bounce off the wood like it was chakra-reinforced steel. The end of the staff met its chest, and with one violent shake its connection to Sasori was blocked, allowing it to limply slump to the ground. In a smooth motion, a simple black rod emerged from Naruto's sleeve, which he quickly used to impale the puppet through the chest, pinning it to the ground and permanently disrupting its chakra. Normally I would be upset that my favorite puppet was damaged, however I feel you will be more than enough compensation for it. Naruto grimaced as he stood back up, keeping an eye on Sasori wearily. All this talk of turning him into a puppet was becoming disconcerting. In any case, Sasori was cut off as both puppeteer and monk were suddenly knocked off balance by an enormous tremor running through the ground. Before it had even stabilized, a roar that could shatter windows and deafen people split the air, making Naruto clutch his ears in pain. Both men looked around to the source of the noise, only to both frown as they saw the very distinctive white head of the Rokubi no Namakuji as it roared into the sky. Naruto frowned because he was worried about his friends. He couldn't be sure if that Biju was still Utakata or whether it would recognize his friends as non-enemies. Sasori, on the other hand, I feel this is somehow Deidara's fault. Tayuya and Haku had just finished evacuating the villagers when the Rokubi itself appeared, roaring up into the sky with its strange, perforated mouth. It was an ugly creature, appearing to be an enormous white slug that was constantly dripping with mucus like a slimy snowman. 6 bulbous, globular tails thrashed about as it roared its newfound freedom to the world, leveling entire buildings with single, careless swipes. One tail thrashed forward, throwing off some of its viscous, clear slime that landed close to the two. It instantly burned through the roof, walls and ground around a house, reducing it to nothing more than a slurry-filled crater. Fuck me, that's a big slug. Haku just nodded hesitantly by Tayuya's side as he stared up at the rampaging Biju. It didn't even seem to be aware of what was going on around it, simply writhing around and destroying everything. Where's Bug Girl? She's the Jinchuriki here. As if to answer her question, a vaguely orange blur shot past them through the air, making their clothes ruffle in the breeze before it was quickly followed by numerous white blurs. It seems she's occupied. As if to affirm Haku's statement, they spotted the bomber shoot past, riding his huge clay dragon that would occasionally spit out smaller, faster dragons at the cost of a part of its tail. These seemed to act as homing missiles of some kind, constantly on Fu's tail as she ducked and weaved through streets trying to shake them off. Unfortunately for her, her shadow clones could not manage partial transformations like she could, as they only contained Chome's chakra, not her will, and quickly lost control of the forms, dispelling themselves, making them useless as distractions. Wait, are you saying that we're the ones that have to face that thing? Haku nodded grimly as he looked up at the still rampaging slug. Around it was quickly dissolving as it shook off more and more of its acidic slime. At least until Fu or Naruto can help us. Tayuya groaned before taking a calming breath, then another, and another. Watch out. The redhead was suddenly tackled to the side by Haku, her eyes wide before they narrowed angrily. The fuck you doing, fem? She trailed off though when she spotted the smoking, dissolving crater where she had just been standing. She looked up at Haku with wide eyes, her cheeks turning a pale shade of red as the ice user looked back down at her, suddenly realizing the slightly compromising position they were in with him straddling her. Haku, you, an ear-splitting roar knocked them out of their stupor as they both winced in sync, Haku quickly rolling off the redhead. Right, the Biju. Haku just nodded quickly, seeming a little flustered as the two dashed off towards the rampaging creature. Fu tucked her wings in and rolled through another tight corner and under an archway in her seemingly endless weave through the village. Not only was she having to keep ahead of the annoyingly fast clay dragons that would explode if they got too close to her, she was now forced to dodge in and out of the random splashes of the Rokubi's corrosive slime. Her only break was the fact that the dragons were no more immune to it than she was, and already more than a few had been taken out by the clear, but lethal mucus. Some other she had managed to make crash into things in her complicated and reckless flight through the village. However, Deidara never seemed to run out of them, and she couldn't look back to see how many more the larger Shisu dragon could make. She grimaced as she suddenly flew up, her wings beating in overtime for the sudden lift. She knew she would have to do something unwholesomely stupid in order to shake the homing missiles off her tail. She did just that as she performed a shudderingly fast and sudden U-turn midair, shooting straight back towards the little dragons and trying to pick up as much speed as she could. Just as she reached the first one, which looked to be reaching out to grab her, she tucked in, folding her wings around herself as she spun through the air, twisting like a human drill. Deidara grinned widely as he saw the girl fly straight into his cloud of missiles, watching them light up and explode one after another, bathing the sky in fire and smoke. However, his hands began to tremble in rage when that same spinning drill re-emerged from the smoke, a scowl sliding across his face. Fu stopped, allowing her blackened and slightly torn wings to unfurl. She hadn't come out of that maneuver unharmed. Her skin was singed in places and reddened from the heat in others, but she was alive, and most of the Shisu dragons were taken care of. The only one remained was the original that Deidara was riding. She knew just the way to defeat it too. Deidara had also decided to take advantage of the lull in combat, calming his irritation at the girl's survival as he willed his dragon to fly forward. He would bathe this girl's last moments in his art if it was the last thing he did. Even Itachi didn't cross his mind at this point. He wanted nothing more than to see this Jinchuriki vanish into flame and smoke. Fu ran through hand seals as fast as she could before throwing her hands out, feeling as the water in the air condensed in front of her to form a perfectly flat, round mirror. Sweden. Mizukagami no Jutsu. Deidara only saw the reflection of his dragon in the mirror before Fu turned the floating water circle 90 degrees. Instantly an exact copy of the dragon, even complete with a duplicate him riding on top, emerged from it. There was too little distance between them though for Deidara to turn away before the two collided. The explosion briefly matched the brightness of the sun as even the Rokubi turned its head to look at it. The resulting shockwave collapsed the nearby buildings and almost blew Haku and Tayuya off their feet as they ran. Fu caught her breath as she hovered there, glad now that Naruto had seen fit for her to learn some of the Mizukage's jutsu as the strongest water type in their group that would use it. Finally, the massive cloud of smoke and dust hanging in the air dispersed as a lone figure dropped out of it, slamming into the ground viciously and creating a decent-sized crater from his fall. Hesitantly and carefully Fu flew down to where Deidara had crashed, spotting his burned, but still alive body lying at the crater's center. Pretty good for a Jinchuriki, The blonde bomber coughed, grinning madly as he tried to stand up, only to collapse back down thanks to his weak limbs. Fu was careful in approaching him as she had been tricked by clay clones before. However, when the blonde bomber showed no sign of turning white, she breathed an internal sigh of relief. But you know, I can't let you win, not without fully experiencing my art, His words were a little shaky and Fu took them as the dying words of a psychopath. However, she still took a step back as a manic look entered his eye. She found she couldn't move her legs fast enough as Deidara suddenly grabbed some clay from his pouch and quickly ate it. his body quickly bulging out grossly until he better resembled a large, vaguely Deidara-esque amorphous blob. Naruto stood in awe as a veritable army of puppets blocked out the sun above him. He couldn't even count them all, but considering the name of the technique there were 100. Their chakra strings were all connected to a compartment in Sasori's chest, hundreds if not thousands of the thin, almost invisible blue threads filling the air in the Akahigi, Hyaki no Suin. However, before he could even fully appreciate the magnitude of the puppet performance, a massive explosion had the surroundings shuddering from the force. For a moment Naruto's eyes widened, thinking the Rokubi had set off a Bijuadama. However, when he looked, it was still thrashing about, parts of its body freezing at irregular intervals. Ah, that would be Deidara finishing up with one of your companions. I may disagree with his concept of art, but he is at least competent as an explosives expert. Naruto's eyes widened even further at that. Before coldly closing, Sasori watched on in curiosity at what he perceived as a sign of mourning. Don't weep for your friend just yet, Kyuubi Jinchuriki, our fight is not over yet. When Naruto didn't answer, Sasori's face twitched slightly, 10 of the puppets in the sky rushing down to remind the blonde their fight wasn't over just yet. However, he was not expecting for the boy to suddenly lash out, black chakra rods sliding into his hands faster than Sasori could even follow, digging each one into the chest of the puppets one by one in an intricate, almost dance-like movement before he paused, eyes still closed. This fight is over, I can't just be stalling anymore, my friends are in danger. Naruto's eyes slowly opened again, however the previously bright, violet color to his Rinnegan had been replaced by a deep, metallic gold. Chapter 66, Clouds Part 4. If you cannot defeat your enemy with the weapon you do have, then imagine one with which you could. Archer. Sasori made no indication he had even noticed the change that had overcome Naruto, specifically in the teen's eyes. However, seeing the blonde so easily dispatch the 10 puppets with minimalistic and efficient movements that were actually a little difficult for even the master puppeteer to follow, he realized something must have changed. He said nothing as the hundreds of chakra threads all began to move and ride in one great, intricate and deadly performance. All 90 of the remaining puppets out in the open flew at blinding speed towards the lone monk, their multitude of varied weapons bright to bear, each dripping with generous doses of poison that would put even a Jinchuriki down. However, even with his near-emotionless puppet body, Sasori couldn't mask his surprise when Naruto made no move to dodge or counter-attack in any way. There was a clang of metal grinding against metal as swords, staffs, axes, halberds, and many other weapons collided with Naruto's skin, none of them even making a scratch against the Asura Path's defense, empowered as it was by Senjutsu. Naruto looked up, his gleaming golden eyes locking with Sasori's for a moment so he could see that his opponent understood just how easy it was to ignore those attacks before slowly, almost languidly closing his eyes. Sasori realized too late what was about to happen as chakra threads moved in a frenzy to pull back the multitude of puppets crowding the blonde. However, there was no distance they could have gone to protect themselves as Naruto's eyes suddenly snapped open, the darker golden ring surrounding his pupil bulging ever so slightly. A wall of force so strong that it was actually visible, thanks to the air it was displacing as it moved, slammed through the army of puppets. Left and right the marionette army was crushed, thrown back or simply rent apart by the destructive gravitational forces that passed through them. Naruto hadn't even had to call out the name of the technique. I see you were holding back on me, Kyuubi Jinchuriki. I feel insulted, although you having the ability of Senjutsu at such a young age is rather incredible. Do you think you would retain that ability as a puppet? I hope so myself. This time Naruto felt nonplussed as Sasori casually discussed his posthumous puppetification. He was still not used, nor did he think he ever would be, to the sheer power he felt as the raw element of nature flowed through his body, strengthening it and enhancing his senses. Sasori, seeing his psychological games were no longer having any effect, hardened his features until they were nothing but a cold, calculating mask. Very well, the destruction of a few puppets is acceptable, they can be rebuilt. Do you want to see just how many I have? How many lives have fallen at my feet only to be honored by their immortalization? Naruto just continued to walk forward towards him, absently sliding a chakra rod out of his sleeve to stab a still twitching puppet lying broken on the ground, never once taking his eyes off the red-headed puppeteer. Don't think this battle is over thanks to a slight power boost, Kyuubi Jinchuriki, you still have yet to face myself. Sasori brought his hands as he jumped back, large propeller-like blades sprouting from his back that whirred to life, carrying up and away from Naruto. The blonde broke into a sprint as compartments in Sasori's palms opened up, revealing two gleaming pipes that wasted no time in rotating suddenly. An intense roar burst from the pipes as white-hot flames, condensed into a concentrated and focused stream, burned through the air at Naruto. However, with nature chakra flowing in harmony through his body, it was as if time was slowed for the young monk. A long chakra rod the length of his body slid from his sleeve as he caught it and began spinning it in front of himself. From behind his own flames, Sasori couldn't see Naruto's right hand spring into blue flame and red burst to life in his left. Banbutsu Suzu, Shinju Kyo. The spinning form of the chakra rod suddenly merged together at the same moment the flames reached the blonde. Sasori's puppet eyes could only widen as the monk flew straight through the stream of flames that could easily melt boulders. For a moment his mind faltered as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. Unfortunately, that gave Naruto enough time to close the distance between them just as the last of the flames leaked from Sasori's handpipe. While the puppeteer's immortal body could feel no pain, he certainly felt the impact as Naruto brought whatever it was he had created around to crash into his stomach. However, it didn't seem to stop. There, and before the red-headed Tsunanuke Nin fully knew what was happening, the flat, circular object had completely sawn through his stomach area. He watched, blinking in confusion as his lower half, complete with some of the prehensile cable he had wrapped up in a compartment there, stumbled a moment before falling to the ground. Naruto landed gracefully on a branch opposite him, still bearing those burning golden eyes as he watched for any signs of tricks from the master puppeteer. That was no summoning, you created something from nothing. A smile slid across the puppeteer's two shiny features as he looked down at the shining bronze mirror-like shield his upper body was laying on, pinned there to a tree by it. Such power is truly in the realm of the gods, to control a god. His eyes glazed slightly at the thought of the power he could wield at his fingertips as Naruto closed the distance between them cautiously, wary for any tricks the living puppet might have. Naruto had barely begun to talk before both combatants blinked, noticing an increasingly large shadow appeared above both their forms. Even Sasori's supposedly inanimate eyes widened in shock as they both looked up. Fu stared up at the sky dazedly, uncomprehending of what was going on around her. There were people, maybe people she knew. She couldn't tell, their forms were blurry and inconsistent and her mind kept slipping when she tried to think of their names. There was a ringing in her ears, it was so loud and all-encompassing she just couldn't focus on anything else. Was she dead? That didn't sound right. No, she still had something to do, didn't she? What was that? What was it she still had to do? Why couldn't she remember? What was with this annoying ringing that blocked out all other sounds? She blinked slowly again, rolling her head as the whisper of a word made it through the buzzing in her ears. Buzzing, why did that sound familiar? Something to do with bugs, right? What was that sound they kept making as she lay there? Was it important? Fu. That's right, her name, it was Fu, such a strange name. Fu, more of a syllable than a word really. Was it just her or was the ringing getting quieter? Oi Fu. Reality crashed back down on the mint-haired girl as she sat upright suddenly, her orange eyes wide with shock as she panted heavily. She immediately noticed Haku kneeling next to her, hand glowing with a calming, soothing green light. She realized why when she took stock of the state her body was in, burns littered her body like her skin was trying out a new color. Her clothing was in tatters and it seemed that the only thing protecting her modesty, what little of it she had in any case, was Haku's kimono top. She had never really noticed how toned the dark-haired Yuki was before. Oi, eyes up Minty. Fu shook her head as Toyuya's voice snapped her back to reality again, a faint tint of red entering her cheeks for a moment. I apologize, it appears I might have a concussion. Haku just nodded, trying to ignore the way Fu's eyes had roamed his bare chest for now. He got enough of that when Toyuya thought he couldn't see her. Luckily that's the worst you got. The burns are only minor and should be healed easily, especially if Naruto does it. It seems your wings took the brunt of the explosion. Sure enough, when Fu looked to her sides she saw the charred, blackened remains of her wings lying limply beside her. With a blink she realized that could have been her. She frowned at that, she had nearly died fighting that bomber. If that hadn't been a suicide move of some kind then he would have won. she would have been in no condition to defend against him. Are you okay? She looked up again, realizing she had been quiet for a little too long. Haku was right to be worried though, she had just had a concussion after all. However, she was just as competent a medic, she knew when she was or was not at 100%. She wasn't, but that was besides the point, she knew she didn't really have a concussion. If you are here, she trailed off as she shakily got to her feet, Haku on hand in case she fell, however she managed it on her own. Does that mean the Rokubi is? He trailed off again, noting the distinct lack of a massive, rampaging slug in the near vicinity. However, there was a rather suspicious trail of mass destruction heading off in the direction of the forest, more specifically in Naruto's direction. Yuya and Haku just widened their eyes in realization as they too looked around. Well, we saw you get hit by that explosion. Haku seemed very confused by the lack of the Biju, his face almost perfectly mirrored by Yuya as they both stared uncomprehendingly at the place it should have been. It was right there a moment ago. If it had been any other situation, Fu might have chuckled at the expression on the redhead's face, however right now laughing would only exacerbate her own wounds. Did you two seriously just lose a Biju? There was a moment of silence before both teens dropped their heads slightly, another comical sight for another time. Naruto dived back just in time to watch as an enormous, slimy white tail crashed down where he had just been standing, easily tearing through trees as large globs of slime began melting the surroundings. Looking up, his golden eyes could only widen at the sight of the Rokubi itself rising up above them, blocking out the light of the sun with its enormous body. Its chakra presence was just immense, standing near it was like having a weight thrown onto his shoulders. It was unlike in his seal where some of the Biju's chakra was filtered away by the bars, out here it was the real thing. However, in his awe at the beast, he nearly allowed himself to get caught as Sasori went on the attack again. He shifted his body to the side as the thick, rasping, prehensile cable that was sharpened to a fine point at one end shot past him. It too glistened with viscous, purple poison, and Naruto knew that even a graze from that weapon could be lethal, and the file-like texture ensures it would easily shear through skin. He had a lot of trust in his Asura Path's defense, but using it dulled his senses, otherwise there should have been no way a Biju could have caught him off guard like that. Granted, it had always kinda been there in the periphery of his senses, so he had mostly paid it no mind, but it had nearly cost him. Matabi had told him that Seiken's slime could even corrode the skin of the other Biju, not that getting close enough to them for that to work would be easy, but it was still an impressive feat, one he would not like to put his reinforced skin up against if he could avoid it. He span as the thick cable shot back around, trying to loop around him and constrict their air from his lungs. However, his eyes pulsed with chakra, halting the cable from coming closer than 2 meters for the single second it took him to jump up and away, just as the Rokubi attempted to crush him with another of its tails. It seemed like the overwhelming chakra he had racing through his system was acting like a beacon for the great slug, calling out to it like a sign pointing right at the blonde. Not only that, but when he looked over, he was shocked to see Sasori had somehow gained full use of his body back. When he glanced over at where his shield was still buried halfway into the tree, he saw that the bisected remains of Sasori's body were still there, however the chest cylinder containing his chakra system was not, meaning he had somehow moved it. This is useless, Kyuubi Jinchuriki, you cannot possibly hope to fight both me and the 4th strongest Biju at the same time, even with your sage mode it is too much for a mere teen. Naruto merely narrowed his eyes before taking a long, calming breath in the lull between the Rokubi's attacks, actually feeling as one great, long tail was lifted high into the air, casting the area around Naruto into shadow. Sasori's puppet eyebrow quirked only momentarily as he felt the enormous chakra building up inside of Naruto. For what he couldn't say, but considering what the boy possessed, it couldn't be good. Gedu. Kusari. Suddenly, and almost without warning, huge great chains, the thickness of Naruto himself, burst from the ground around the blonde, each a deep, obsidian black and tipped with vicious, barbed tips. They flew up into the air like enormous pythons, encircling the Rokubi in great, sweeping motions as it seemed to be encapsulated in some strange, rotating cage. Then, all of a sudden, they constricted, sweeping into tighten around Seiken and locking together at the tips above his head. If Sasori was still human, he would have gulped in shock as he stared up at the Biju, completely suppressed, like Naruto were simply training some common pet. I am possible, this power, it is on the scale of Hashirama Senju. For the first time in the many years since Sasori had abandoned his home and his family as a nuke nin, he took a step back in fear. So lost in his shock was he that he never noticed the single, smaller chain that slowly crept from the ground behind him, lunging forward to skewer him straight through the chest cavity, missing the last of his living flesh by only centimeters. His face was frozen into an expression of shock and fear as the chakra chain disrupted the control he had over his own body. Chakra threads from the living core uselessly flailed about, unable to do anything as control over the puppet body was wrenched from it. It's over. Naruto walked slowly over to the frozen puppeteer, his eyes still burning with chakra. Sasori found his own eyes frozen on those glowing amber orbs, ringed like ripples in a lake of molten gold. With his own chakra now in full control of Sasori's body, he brought the chain around and Sasori was able to spot that it had emerged from Naruto's sleeve, like his other chakra rods. Seeing that there were no more traps, no more tricks and nothing else Sasori could do, the blonde gave the puppeteer back his control over his head. Why? The first thing Sasori did was blink as he asked the question at the forefront of his mind. Naruto merely tilted his head in confusion. You could have pierced me directly through my core, you knew that would kill me, so why didn't you? His voice seemed genuinely confused, as much as that could convey through his near emotionless facade. Because I didn't have to. Sasori's eyes narrowed, taking that as an insult, as if Naruto could deal with him so easily he didn't even warrant killing. You are naive boy. You think this ability to stay your hand from bloodshed is noble. It is only foolish to leave your enemies in a position to stab your back. Naruto's eyes crinkled slightly in amusement as the chain lifted slightly, bringing the puppet closer to him. It doesn't seem like you are in a position to stab anybody right now. Sasori grimaced. Right now, it was true, the only thing he could even move of his body was his head, and for some reason he couldn't eject his core to attempt to find another body. Then what? You will leave me alive. Unable to move anything other than my head like some pitiful invalid. His eyes narrowed spitefully at the thought, his immortality would come as more of a curse if that was the case. I would rather die. Naruto's eyes lost their humor, startling the puppeteer as the previously warm golden eyes became colder, steelier. Don't be so quick to throw away your own life, even as perverse as you have made it. A small sigh was hidden from the blonde's lips as he finally sensed his friends, feeling the warm relief rush through him at their familiar chakra signatures, still burning strong. He had been unbelievably worried when the Rokubi had appeared. He thought his friends might have been killed by the rampaging Biju. Anyway, I still haven't decided on what to do with you. Sasori scowled, gone now with the pretense of his emotionless mask. After all, he could only move his face, he might as well use that to the fullest extent he could. My life in the hands of a mere boy no more than 16, disgraceful. What do you want then? Information, I assume. I was the spymaster for the Akatsuki after all. Naruto quirked an eyebrow, the chains binding down the Rokubi tightening slightly as he felt the beast try to escape. You gave away that information rather quickly. Sasori just maintained his frown, however his glassy eyes had a hint of defeat in them. The puppeteer knew full well what happened next was up to the monk before him. It was that, or he could hope his idiot of a partner managed to escape and was actually foolish enough to try and rescue him. Either way, his life was in the hands of a blonde. What is the point of concealing it when these might be my last words? Naruto frowned at that. Even in his enemies it was unpleasant seeing such an air of hopelessness befall anybody. I already told you that I hadn't decided to do anything yet. Sasori actually managed to quirk the edges of his smooth lips up in amusement, a hollow, humorless smile that was void of any warmth. You really are naive, aren't why? Naruto and Sasori's eyes widened at the exact same moment as a light whistling entered both their ears. With his enhanced senses, Naruto was able to spin, catching the kunai flying through the air towards them by the handle. However, too late he realized it was a distraction, the tag on the kunai already burning up. He threw it too late, the blinding light of a flash tag forcing him to close his eyes for just a second. It was enough though. He heard a dull thud, and when he opened his eyes again, Sasori's face was forever locked in a visage of reassignment, glassy eyes looking forward lifelessly as a kunai stuck out of his core. Naruto's eyes widened as he looked down at the blood on his hands and robes. He had sensed it for just a fraction of a moment. A single presence, right at the edge of his Sage Mode's sensory range, that had appeared and disappeared in a mere flicker. The chain holding up Sasori's lifeless body disintegrated in his surprise, allowing the puppet to fall with a crunch to the floor, already littered with the shattered remains of the man's collection, just another body among 100. Naruto looked down at it, still shocked by the man's sudden death by the unknown assailant. However, Sasori could only stare up at the sky, unblinking, his dreams of immortality now forever out of his grasp. Another blonde watched the entire encounter with a frown, cradling his broken arm as he viewed monk and puppeteer alike from a very safe distance in the trees, using his eyepiece to enhance his view. He had arrived just as Naruto restrained the Biju, a feat he was still in shock over. He had seen only one other man wield that kind of power with such ease, and the thought of there being two of them was simply frightening. He thought that Itachi was his main rival, only because when compared to people like that Itachi only scratched their league. Oh man, I never though. Sasori Dana would be the one to go, I wonder who threw that kunai. He hadn't sensed anybody nearby when the simple weapon was thrown, and it had managed to sneak past the senses of the monk, who seemed to be in some kind of enhanced state. That would be me. Deidara's eyes widened at the new voice, whirling around to defend himself. However, he only caught a flash of orange before he felt his whole world twist and contort as if his vision was being wrung out by some large, invisible hands. Then, darkness. Once Naruto was sure the attacker was not going to strike again, he had realized the assailant had been after Sasori all along and not him. He allowed a small smile to work its way onto his face as he turned to see his friends walk into the clearing, or in Fu's case, stumble. He worried for a moment as he looked over the mint-haired girl's state, but he almost chuckled as they all gaped at the Rokubi, still tied roughly to the ground by looping and overlapping black chains, each linked the same size they were. It too turned to look at the newcomers, roaring loudly at them in its strange, high-pitched and garbled way, as if it were trying to speak through water. Setting his features, Naruto walked out in front of the beast, throwing a comforting wave towards his friends as he moved to stand in front of the Biju, his eyes still burning golden with nature chakra. He had found, interestingly enough, that he could maintain Sage Mode for an incredible amount of time. Once he had actually made the link with nature itself, he could continuously draw in its chakra through his Preta path. The only problem was that after a certain amount of time, around 15 minutes, it began to get exhausting to maintain. He could go longer, but the strain it put on his body probably wasn't worth it. Seiken. He had hoped the Rokubi might respond to its name in some way, however when he looked up at those twitching, stalk-like antennae, he saw no recognition, or even anything to suggest intelligence behind all that rage and power. He frowned slightly. This wasn't right. The Biju were all intelligent to a varied degree, they were all thinking, living beings. Saiken. His voice, enhanced by chakra, finally managed to catch the great slug's attention, however not in a good way. It wormed and writhed in its bonds as it turned to face the young monk, suddenly throwing its bulbous head up into the air. Get back. Naruto quickly realized just what was about to happen as black and white balls of almost liquid chakra began to be drawn from the air, collecting above the Rokubi's perforated mouth. They all drew together until a large, pulsating ball of dark chakra hung in the air above the Biju, practically glowing with sheer energy. The Rokubi couldn't actually reach up to swallow the dense Amari, so it did the next best thing, throwing its head forward as it launched one of the most powerful attacks known to shinobi right at the group of teens. Shinra Tensai. Naruto threw both his hands up as a wave of explosive gravitational forces crashed forward from his body, quickly meeting the uncompressed Bijuadama. However, to his shock, his Diva Path's attack only halted the Amari, it didn't deflect it like he hoped. Already he could see it was beginning to become unstable after being out of the Rokubi's control for so long. If it exploded here, then the compressed energies contained within would level this entire clearing, plus a great deal of land around it. Without even thinking, the blonde suddenly rushed forward, throwing his arms out wide as a determined look passed through his golden eyes. Senpo. Gakido. A corona of bright blue light expanded out from him just as the Bijuadama finally destabilized, bathing the clearing in a veil of bite. Blinding light. For a moment before it was all seemingly sucked away. Naruto stood right at the epicenter, clenching his teeth as bit by bit, all the chakra from the Amari drained into his body. His arms trembled, trying to stay as still as possible, as he was forced to not only draw in the extra chakra, but balance it with the senjutsu already in his body. Finally, with a grunt of exertion, the last of the attack faded from view, allowing Naruto to fall forward onto his knees, the gold finally fading from his eyes as exhaustion caught up with him. Naruto. He found Fu by his side not even a moment later, stopping him from falling face first to the ground. He chuckled to himself. Typical. Despite being gravely injured herself, Fu cast aside her own concerns to see if he was okay, and he was just lying here helplessly. He grimaced as he forced himself back to his feet, masking just how heavy his body felt at that moment. I'm fine. He took a step forward, and when he was confident he wouldn't stumble, another, and another, until he was standing in front of the Rokubi again. Seiken. Once again he received nothing but a roar of rage and anger as a response. However, he had tightened the chains immensely around the beast. He wouldn't let it form another Bijuadama this time. He wouldn't have time to gather enough nature chakra to absorb it. Is Utakata okay? Fu was beside him again, looking up at the face of the Biju impassively, although Naruto could tell standing in front of its overwhelming presence was taking its toll on her, as evidenced by the light sheen of sweat on her forehead. However, Naruto could only look down in sadness with his fist lightly clenched and trembling. Utakata is gone. I can't even feel his chakra anymore. When the Rokubi broke free, it tore his body apart. Fu's eyes widened marginally before she too looked down, a troubled expression breaking through her mask as she allowed herself to briefly mourn the loss of a Jinchuriki like them. So what are you going to do? Absorb it. Naruto frowned. He hated that with every encounter with a Biju he ended up taking it into himself. This was not what he had intended. He had wanted to help the Biju, not seal them within himself. However, at the same time he knew leaving it free, especially in the state of mind it was in now, would only lead others to seal it, and then they would simply face the same problem with the Akatsuki. However, he lacked the sealing ability to place the Biju into anything other than himself, Fu, or the Kohaku no Juhei. Fu would burn up with two of the chakra creatures inside of her, and the Kohaku no Juhei was a temporary solution at best. The artifact wouldn't hold chakra of that magnitude for long, as the repeated sealing of the Hachibi had shown. That only left himself as a viable option. Stealing his gaze, he looked up at Seiken on last time as the chains binding it began to glow an ethereal blue. I don't know if you understand me right now, but I'm sorry for this. Why won't you tell me anything? Naruto had actually raised his voice as he stood at the center of the mighty room that was made up of the Biju's individual cages. He had come into the seal shortly after fully assimilating the Rokubi, firstly to fix the internal damage that it was sure to cause. He was lucky though that it had been almost 3 years since he had sealed the Gobi, that had given his body plenty of time to adjust, so the transfer itself went almost as smoothly as when he had first absorbed Shukaku. It helped he went much slower as well. Secondly, he wanted to know something from his tenants, something that had been niggling at his mind ever since seeing Seiken rampage in his fight with Sasori. The Rokubi itself seemed to be unconscious through all of this, seemingly having been pacified by his chains to the point where it had practically melted into a white puddle in its cage next to the Kyubis. So instead he was asking the rest of his tenants, however they weren't very forthcoming with the answers he wanted. He wouldn't quite say he was demanding them, but he was insisting rather strongly. It is not quite so simple, Ninjin. Isobu oddly enough was the first to speak to him, 3 years doing a lot to proverbially, and literally, bring her out of her shell. He looked around at her, but that was when the confidence seemingly left her and she became quiet. I just want to understand, what was wrong with Seiken out there? Why didn't he seem to recognize his own name? Some of the Biju, like Matabi and Kokuo, looked down at that while the Kyubi simply huffed from its cage, turning disinterestedly away from the conversation. Naruto already knew the fox wouldn't answer his questions. You demand a lot from us, Ninjin. This time it was Son Goku who spoke, however when Naruto looked around he did not shy away. We do not need to explain to you why we do things, we simply are. Naruto sighed in frustration as he leant on his shakuju, the events from the day beginning to really catch up to him. Can you at least tell me why you do not wish me to know? Again the room was silent as the Biju simply stared at him. With one last sigh, Naruto just nodded concedingly. He could always come back and try again when he was less tired, for now he needed to go back and finish healing Fu. Very well, I will come back once Seiken has woken up. I'm sure he will have questions. With that he simply faded from view, as if he had never been there at all. Chapter 67, Clouds Part 5. Laws control the lesser man. right conduct controls the greater one, Mark Twain. Oni no Kuni. Naruto looked up quizzically from the rock he was sitting on. The sky was lit up by a multitude of stars, made slightly hazy from the smoke drifting up from their campfire. It had been a few days since their second encounter with Akatsuki and Naruto absorbing the Rokubi, and the group had been resting in the forests north of the fishing village. They had spent their time helping the villagers recover from the attack. Many had been injured during Deidara's and Utakata's fight. Right now though, Naruto was sat outside on a rock on a loose meditative position, Tayuya sitting across from him with Haku to her side and Fu up on a tree branch above them. Yeah, it's someplace across the sea from Mizu no Kuni, along with a few other countries you don't usually hear about. I used to hear Orochimaru muttering things about setting up bases there, so there has to at least be something worthwhile there. Naruto didn't seem convinced as he looked up at Fu, seeing her equally skeptical face. I don't know, it's a lot to go on from just the name of the country. It could mean anything. Tayuya scowled at that, pointing up at Fu as if she were trying to knock the girl off the branch with her non-existent telekinetic powers. Oh come on, if you had heard it from her we would already been leaving by now. Naruto sighed, leaning back on the rock, but looked across at Tayuya in amusement. I don't play favorites like that, Tayuya. The redhead just snorted, folding her arms under her chest in a very childish manner and glaring at the blonde. Yeah, sure you don't. The young monk simply sighed again, Shikuju jingling as he shifted his weight, looking over to Haku. He could always count on him to be the voice of reason among the group, especially when it came to their resident redhead. What do you think? Is it worth a shot? Haku just looked down thoughtfully, rubbing his chin lightly and wishing, not for the first time, he actually had some facial hair to stroke. Damn genetics. I think that it couldn't hurt. The worst that could happen is we find nothing but we have traveled, perhaps learning something else of equal or maybe greater importance. Naruto considered the ice user's words for a few moments before nodding concedingly, not denying his logic. Traveling was what they did after all. Alright then, I suppose if we want to find something out about the Biju, somewhere called Oni no Kuni might be a good idea. Tayuya just grinned, glad to finally be the one leading the group, even if only in a small way. She turned to Haku, still beaming, and lightly poked him on the shoulder, smirking cheekily as his disgruntled expression. Good boy. Haku just scowled at the former Oto Kunoichi, looking back towards Naruto with a frown. Is it too late to take back my decision? Naruto just chuckled amusedly as he slid casually off the boulder he had been sitting on, landing silently on the ground. I'm afraid not. Haku just sighed, practically feeling Tayuya poke her tongue out at him immaturely from behind his back. The two teens walked off to their sleeping bags, intent on getting some rest after a tiring day. Tayuya may not have been helping with the healing, but she was able to lift objects the villagers couldn't and had been aiding in the various buildings' reconstruction. Although she constantly complained that there was little you could reconstruct from a fucking pile of shitty-ass sludge, Haku simply found it amusing when she would tread in it. Or at least he had, until the redhead had managed to slip on something and fall front first into a small pile of it. Needless to say, her clothes hadn't survived and Haku had struggled to remove the blush from his face the rest of the day. Are you okay? The blonde looked up, seeing Fu had dropped down next to him and was looking at him with some concern. He knew what it was about, and he knew he had just been in deep thought, so it looked like he was spacing out. He just smiled softly and kissed his fellow Jinchuriki on the cheek, hugging her for a moment as she tentatively accepted the embrace. I'm fine, you don't have to worry about me so much, Fu. The mint-haired girl just nodded, concealing her small frown as Naruto broke the embrace, walking over to his sleeping mat. However, she wasn't convinced, thinking back to that first day after the incident with the Akatsuki. Fu dashed through the trees, fearing the worst as the sounds of trees crashing down got louder and louder. Her injuries burned slightly, but she ignored the discomfort, scared for Naruto as she finally broke out of the tree line, only to gape in shock. A huge clearing, almost 200 meters wide, had been completely leveled. Trees were smashed to splinters and in some places large, irregular craters in the earth dotted the forest floor. It was pure destruction, however that didn't shock her all that much. She was desensitized to such mass destruction, it was the cause that was the shock. Naruto stood at the center of the clearing, hands clenching and unclenching into fists as he breathed deeply, taking in his surroundings with a calm, detached gaze. Then, faster than he normally would, He shot his arm up, a massive concussive blast of pure force rippling out from his palm to reduce another section of the clearing into nothing but rubble and flattened earth. Then again, he whirled around and raised his other hand, crushing a few trees into tiny shards of wood. Finally he paused, but only for a moment before his eyes snapped open wider and a huge crater, half the size of the clearing itself, simply seemed to expand out from him. Naruto. Fu could only continue to stare in shock. Orange eyes widened as a wall of air shot past her, ruffling her clothes and hair. Her voice was only a whisper, but in the eerie calm of the newly made clearing Naruto managed to hear her, turning slowly to look at her. Fu, you know you should be resting. Your injuries haven't fully healed yet. Had Fu been in any less control of her own emotions she would have gaped at that. Instead the mint-haired girl opted to simply flash forward in a burst of speed, appearing before the young monk with a stern look. What about you? The last time you absorbed a biju you needed a week to recover. She looked around again, marveling at the pure destruction Naruto had managed to cause from up close. And what is this? Naruto just sighed, taking a look around at his surroundings as well before chuckling weakly. Would you believe me if I told you I'm making it easier for the villagers to get lumber? Fu's eyes simply narrowed as Naruto rubbed the back of his head sheepishly before frowning. Last time was different, you know. Shukaku caught me by surprise with the gobi and I wasn't ready for it. This time I took it slow, I could prepare. He looked back up only to say Fu still looking at him sternly, arms now crossed over her chest. That isn't what I meant. She took another purposeful look at the ton-up surroundings before looking back to Naruto. The blonde for his part simply sighed in defeat, the playful sheepishness fading from his eyes. I wasn't strong enough, Fu. The former Taki nin just blinked in surprise, wondering what the blonde meant, however he quickly clarified as he saw her confusion. Back there with the Rokubi, I couldn't deflect that Bijuadama. If I hadn't been using Senjutsu I don't think I would have been able to absorb that attack, you would have all been hurt. Fu's frown melted into a softer expression as she moved closer to the blonde, tentatively wrapping her arms around him as Naruto accepted the hug after a moment's hesitation. Naruto, we don't expect you to be all-powerful. We are still just teens, you are still only 16. You don't have to be invincible to be strong. Don't burden yourself with expectations that nobody but yourself has. Naruto's head hung a little lower before he looked back up, smiling sadly. That's just it, Fu, they're the expectations I have. The expectations I have to have because if I don't push myself to be stronger, then what happens if there's an attack I really can't deflect? What happens if there's an enemy I can't overcome? Who'll protect you, Tayuya, Haku, the people I care about? Fu gulped slightly at the raw emotion in Naruto's voice, finding herself clutching him to herself more tightly as if he would simply fade away. You always have us, if that ever happens you will always have us standing by your side to help cover the gap. She broke away, looking meaningfully into his eyes for a moment. You will always have me by your side, not hiding behind you needing you to do everything. The two simply shared that gaze for a moment before Fu could literally see the tension leave Naruto's body, a soft smile slowly sliding across his face. He backed away and sat down on a nearby destroyed log, Fu quickly joining him. Thanks Fu, it just gets so heavy sometimes. Fu could see that, recently Naruto had seemed more detached from everything, having longer thoughtful moments to himself. Then share some of the weight. The blonde's smile widened as he instinctively moved to kiss Fu, however the girl anticipated it and instead of her cheek he met her soft lips. Rippled eyes widened for a moment in surprise before softening into a look of bliss as Fu made to deepen the contact. It was only a breathless minute later that the two teens parted from the other's touch, cheeks rosier and smiles a little wider. They sat there in silence for a while. Before Naruto chuckled, "Did you know I can't use Shinra Tensei consecutively?" Fu blinked at the odd question before shaking her head. She hadn't known that, but then again she had never seen Naruto need to use them so quickly before. Yeah, me neither. Turns out that after using one it almost blocks my chakra system from using that particular form of molding for about 3 seconds. I had never noticed before. Fu looked around, motioning to the damage done to what had previously been a perfectly normal sector of forestry. Is that what you were doing, testing your limits? Naruto just shrugged non-committally, getting an approving nod from the other Jinchuriki. Knowing your own limits was important so that you knew what you were capable of and so that you knew how to overcome them. How about testing something else then? Naruto just raised an eyebrow in curiosity at the somehow too innocent look in the girl's face. He hadn't even known she could make that expression. What did you have in MI? He was cut off. His warm, soft lips met his own once again, freezing his mind for a split second before Fu parted again, smiling at him tenderly with lidded eyes. Oh. Tayuya and Haku didn't see the two for another few hours that night. I already told you, it was a joke, don't take it too seriously. A whiny, high-pitched voice reverberated around a small, dank cave that was sparsely lit by only a small oil lamp atop a simply wooden table. It was juvenile and unnecessary. Sometimes you are far too much like Spiral. In comparison, the deeper, raspier voice that answered it couldn't have been more different. It was darker, more ominous. I think I'll take that as a compliment. After all, Spiral Senpai was a good guy, like Toby. The darker voice simply grunted in annoyance, alone yellow eyes narrowing contemptuously. I don't understand why you encourage him with that idiotic personality. It is beneath someone of his lineage. The higher-pitched, more childish voice just chuckled lightheartedly. Oh, it's all in good fun. After all, if he was serious all the time, what would be the fun in that? Another grunt was his response as the person to whom the deeper voice belonged to looked away in irritation. This is not about fun. If Master Sama were here, he would waste no time eliminating that degrading personality of his. The higher-pitched voice simply sighed, as if this very same conversation and argument had happened many times before. If an outsider were to look in on this conversation, they might have seen quite possibly the strangest sight in their lives. A strange, black-cloaked man with green hair that appeared to have long, Venus flytrap-like extensions growing from his shoulders was arguing with himself. Except that wasn't quite true. The man had two halves, literally, a black and a white half, perfectly bisecting him vertically. The deeper voice belonged to the black half that seemed to have no visible mouth and a deep, pupil-less yellow eye with no sclera. The higher-pitched, more whimsical voice belonged to the white half who had more normal facial features. In any case, however, both went quite as they spotted a slight rippling of the air in one corner of the cave. In a blur of chakra and twisted, displaced air, another man stepped into the darkness of the cave, casually throwing a slightly taller, unconscious blonde to the ground. They both wore the Akatsuki cloak. However, the newcomer also bore a spiraled orange mask over his face, the right eyehole being the center of the whirlpool-like design. Is Toby okay? The man looked up, as if he were only noticed the strange, two-toned man for the first time. However, Zetsu wasn't a fool. He knew perfectly well this man had known exactly where he was from the second he appeared in his space-time ninjutsu. Zetsu, I need you to go keep track of the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. The plant-like man stood slightly taller at that, sensing the serious tone in his master's voice as he could practically feel his lone eye narrow dangerously. Do not lose him this time. The half-black half-white man quickly nodded, both sides of him feeling the oppressive weight of the man's chakra. Of course. Right away, Toby. Zetsu wasted no time in melting through the floor, connecting with nature once again to quickly take off, searching out a specific chakra signature. Fool. The masked man was left alone in the dark cave, staring down at the limp form of the Iwa Nuke Nin before sighing, removing his mask to casually toss it down on the table before taking a seat on the slightly damp floor. It would appear I severely underestimated the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. The man chuckled in slight amusement as Deidara moaned slightly, drooling onto the floor in his unconscious haze. Not to mention the company he keeps. He sighed, rubbing the right side of his face lightly as he had a tendency to do in private. To think he awakened the Rinnegan, this couldn't have been foreseen. A thoughtful look passed over his face, brow crinkling slightly. Maybe this could be used to my advantage. He sat back, going over the meticulous plans upon plans he had set in place before now, spanning decades in complexity. None of them had planned for this eventuality though, how could he? He sighed, shaking his head. Eventually he would have to pit them against one another, however that conflict would be the linchpin of what came after, the victor determining how his plans would unravel, always towards the same ends, of course, just details. Yes. He nodded to himself, a sly smile crossing over his pale features that the flickering light from the oil lamp cast into an eerie glow. That was certainly the solution, but first, a test of his powers, that would be important also. His smile descended into a smirk as he reached for his mask, clipping it on over his features as he stood up. He knew the perfect people for the job. His deep red Sharingan blazed in the darkness as the air twisted and warped around him. Then, he was gone, taking Deidara with him as the cave once again became silent. Waves crashed against the large boat in rhythm with the motion of the vessel, causing the ship to undulate in what many considered to be a sickening motion. However, Naruto, standing at the prow of the ship, found it calming. Out here on the ocean, with water practically saturating the air for miles around, his vision was at its greatest, not that he could sense anything other than the occasional bird or ship very far off in the distance. The journey between South Mizu no Kuni and the continent to the east of the elemental nations took around a week, and they were nearing the end of the trip. In fact, if Naruto pushed his senses out to the max, he could actually feel the shore 4 kilometers away. What are you thinking about? Naruto didn't even have to turn to know Haku was standing right behind him, being able to feel everybody on the ship from where he was. Everything and nothing. Haku just gave an amused smile as he walked forward, resting his arms against the guard rail of the ship and staring out at the panoramic view of the ocean around them. The rushing waters reflected the light of the stars above them, like each little pinprick of light was submerged in the watery depths. So nothing complicated. Naruto grinned as he turned, resting his back against the same railing as he turned to his only male companion. You're not usually so talkative, Haku. What changed? Haku grimaced as he looked back towards the stairwell that led down to the crew cabins. Tayuya snores. The blonde was quiet for a moment before both boys broke out into laughter. When they had come onto the ship, there had only been 2 free cabins. Naturally, Fu had opted to share with Naruto, leaving the redhead and the ice user to their own devices. Both boys sighed lightly as they leant back on the handrail, looking in no particular direction as they were both left to their thoughts. Naruto glanced across at Haku for a moment, taking in the boys' new appearance. All of their previous clothes had in some way been damaged by their respective fights, so in a town they passed, Naruto had decided they all needed new clothes. There was also the matter that, after around a year of not buying anything new and a lot of growing, they had outgrown the majority of their clothing. The Yuki himself hadn't actually changed all that much, sticking with baggy brown pants that stopped just above his ankles, revealing the traditional, but tailored Geta sandals he wore lower down to the ground than most were. He had also acquired a few new short-sleeved kimono tops, his favorite being a deep blue one with a simple cream trim that reminded him of the one he often wore when he traveled with Zabuza. Under that he wore a modest long-sleeved brown shirt, a similar color to his pants. In a similar vein to the nostalgic clothes, Haku had asked Naruto to make him a plain white porcelain mask, which he himself had added a long red wave-like design to. It now hung at his waist, moving slightly with the ocean breeze. He completely the look with a flowing red sash tied around his waist that would whip out behind him wildly when he ran. That wasn't to say Naruto hadn't changed his own look, now wearing a loose red robe that flowed down to his knees, with wide sleeves, open at the front to reveal a simple beige shirt. The necklace he got from Fu proudly hung around his neck, gleaming in the weak light of the moon with its own faint light. Like Haku, he wore baggy brown pants ending just above his ankles. However, he wore more modern Zori sandals that made walking along silently almost effortless. He still wore his forehead protector and earring, though they were treasured gifts after all. Finally, he had a deep scarlet obi around his waist, under his robe. Tayuya had probably been the most liberal in her change, doing anything to hide her former connection to Otogakure. She had abandoned her old beige tunic, going instead for a dark gray sleeveless kimono top over a traditional shinobi mesh shirt. The kimono hung low enough to double as a skirt, but she also had a set of fishnet shorts that poked out just below it. A red obi wrapped around her midsection, just beneath her bust, while the kimono was complemented by a set of identically colored, very baggy sleeves that were tied on just below her shoulders. Finally, she had a simple, lighter gray neck wrap to go with the dark gray beanie that she wore over her long hair, now brushing the base of her spine thanks to the fact she never cut it. Finally, there was Fu. To be honest, if the Nanabi Jinchuriki had had her way, she would have found clothes identical to the ones she had been wearing since leaving Tokigakure. However, Naruto had managed to get her to try something else for once, just so she had something different to experience. She kept her white arm warmers, however they were now complementing a muted white vest that was split down the middle. It would have revealed her chest save for the top she wore under it, similar to the one she had worn as a kunoichi but without the fishnet undershirt. Her skirt remained the same, as did the fishnet shorts, however her white sandals now stretched all the way up her calves, almost up to her knees. In all, Naruto felt as though the changes they had made to their appearance reflected the gradual changes that had overcome them during their time traveling. Now they looked as mature as they felt. Naruto especially thought he had made a significant change, no longer simply wearing his monk robes because he wanted to impress his senpai and master. He now wore comfortable clothes that still gave off the same vibe as his robes, although he probably wouldn't be recognized as a monk without his shikuju, but that was okay. He turned his head to look out at the sea, a curious expression crossing his features that Haku caught, looking out in the same direction. What is it? Naruto just narrowed his eyes trying to spot what it was he was sensing. It was hard though with only the weak light of the moon to go on. Finally though he found the chakra signatures and pointed up to the sky where the silhouettes of what appeared to be very large birds far off could be seen. It's people. Naruto had an almost bemused look on his face as his eyes tracked the dim chakra signatures that soared across the sky in a tight V formation in the general direction of Hinokuni. It's people, but they're flying. He blinked before shaking his head to check he wasn't seeing things. Haku was straining his eyes to see, but finally he caught their movement, widening his eyes in surprise. How? Naruto's eyes widened a little as he observed the flying people. No doubt shinobi considering their use of chakra in this unorthodox way. Strange, I think they're using some kind of machine they are strapped into in combination with chakra running over each side to provide lift. They look like they have massive metal wings. Haku had to nod at the ingenuity of the idea, and the fact so many were using it could only mean it was efficient. He chuckled, catching Naruto's attention. Should we tell Fu? She has some competition now. Naruto smiled, turning back to watch as the flying ninja in formation banked in perfect sync, heading back out to wherever they came from. Probably a ship given how much chakra went into the devices and considering the fact they were flying away from the continent. Well, it's certainly not something you see every day. Haku just nodded as the two descended back into a comfortable silence, enjoying the night air. Aw, would you hurry the fuck up, Kakuzu? How long does it take to argue with this heathen? On the coast of Hinokuni there was a small ratty town notorious for its reputation that one could buy anything there for the right price. 3 men stood on a dock. One was a typical sailor, brawny, wearing worn, dirtied clothing smelling of sake and rum. However, the other 2 would have turned heads if they didn't cast off such an ominous aura that made most afraid to look. Quiet, you imbecile. It is bartering, not arguing, and if you continue to interrupt I'll kill you. The first, with a deep, gruff voice that spoke of age, was the taller of the duo, although the majority of his body was hidden by a dark black cloak covered in red cloud decals. He wore a light gray cowl over his head and a thin black veil over his mouth, only allowing his strange green eyes with distinctive red sclera to be seen, standing in stark contrast to his deep tan skin. The only thing that could be used to identify him was the oddly pointed headband with the slashed symbol for Takigaker. Ha! As if you could, or haven't tried before. The second man, with the higher but no less dangerous voice, chose to wear his cloak, identical to the taller man's, open at the front, revealing his bare chest and the slashed Yugaker headband around his neck and the pendant resting below it. It was a small, red metal medallion of an inverted triangle set inside a circle. He was a fairly average man, his only distinguishing features were his slicked back silver hair and vivid purple eyes that might have attracted people to him if it weren't for his vulgar attitude. However, the most eye-catching thing about his person was the large, vicious scythe slung over his shoulder, 3 blades protruding from the end, one below another. I said, quiet Hidan, haggling is a delicate process if we want to come out with a better deal. Hidan merely sneered at the older and larger man, swinging his scythe down to dig into the ground, revealing the cable that ran from its base up his cloak sleeve. Whatever, why don't you just threaten the fucker, take the boat that way? He sneered as he looked over the brawny, but nonetheless civilian sailor. The heathen would deserve it anyway. I haven't been able to appease Jashin-sama for a while now and our shared pain would be like ecstasy. Kakuzu leveled a steady gaze at his younger partner before turning back to the sailor. I said shut up. Hidan scowled but didn't say anything else, instead turning his gaze out to sea. He didn't understand why they had to come out here to get a boat, but this is where they were told to go, and as long as there were heathens to offer up to his lord he would be happy. The wind whistled loudly through large canyon, a deep trench-like gorge that split the earth like some great wound. High up on one of the rocky cliffs, slick from a recent downpour, 5 men stood gazing down at a small temple-like structure built into the opposite wall at the base of the canyon. The wind blew their clothes around wildly, looking almost like medical scrubs, only with odd gray designs littering the white material. The one in the front with long black hair and a goatee, wearing darker clothing, grinned viciously as he leaned over the edge of the cliff, watching the 2 men guarding the temple with a keen eye. Yes, this is the night our dark Iryojutsu was made for, this is the night I've been waiting for. Moryu-sama would be proud of us. He threw his arms up as he walked back to stand behind his 4 subordinates, still grinning madly. Now, time for your prescription. His chakra flared for a moment before 4 vine-like tentacles burst from the earth, hovering there for a moment before darting forward, sticking straight into the necks of the 4 men. The tentacles pulsed brightly with a deep, foreboding purple chakra as the 4 men winced slightly from the invasive technique before it finally stopped, giving the men a moment to flex their limbs. They could literally feel the new, overwhelming power flowing through their system, making them stronger, faster, better. Now go, serve Moryu-sama this night. The men needed no further instruction, darting straight off the cliff with grins on their faces. The last man simply stayed up on the cliff, a smirk drawing itself on his face as the sounds of screaming and the orange glow of flames rose into the moonlit night. Ah! Startlingly violet, pupilless eyes snapped open in shock as a young teen, around 15, suddenly sat up in her bed, panting and breathing heavily as a light sheen of sweat covered her form. She sat there for a moment just staring ahead sightlessly with wide eyes as the sound of hurried footsteps over tatami mats could be heard. The sliding door was thrown open by a young bespectacled man with limp brown hair that appeared to have gotten up in a hurry if his disheveled clothes were any indication. "Shien-sama, are you okay?" The girl didn't answer for a few moments, just collecting herself before she looked up, her face becoming an impassive mask as she causally wiped some of the sweat from her brow. "It was nothing, Taruho, I just had another vision." The young man's face saddened slightly as he stood up straighter, a resigned look passing over his features. "Oh, I shall tell the unfortunate soul in the morning then." Shien simply nodded once, letting the man bow quickly before taking his lead back to his own room. The young girl with pale blonde hair lay back down on her futon gracefully staring up at the ceiling, knowing she would not be getting any more sleep that night. Finally a small, confused sigh escaped her lips as her purple eyes narrowed. "Just who are you, Naruto Uzumaki?" Chapter 68, Clouds Part 6. Perhaps one cannot see the future, but with enough time and effort one can create it. Kome Shokatsuryu. The acrid stench of smoke saturated the air outside the spacious room as Shien watched her temple burn. Her face remained completely impassive as the man in front of her slumped limply to the side, the look of blind dedication on his face forever frozen there in his death. She didn't even blink as his blood ran slowly over the fallen blinds that had once hung from around her bed. She perfectly maintained her dignified pose as her cold, unwavering eyes studied the 4 men in front of her, advancing on her slowly. She had to fight back the small sneer at their unpleasant, transformed appearances, clashing with their clean, unsullied medical robes. "Pretty little priestess, your life is ours now." Even their voices were unpleasant, grating on her ears, however she still didn't react, even as Taruho slowly backed up in front of her, sword raised in shaky hands. The atmosphere of the room was tense as the men walked closer, confident smirks and large, almost insane grins on their faces. Or at least it was intense until, hello. Even Shien had to blink when a blonde mop of hair suddenly appeared around the side of the door, rippled eyes blinking at the odd scene before him, hardening slightly at the sight of the slowly bleeding out man in the room. "Am I interrupting something?" He fully entered the doorway, the light behind him casting his form into silhouette. From that position only his violet eyes and the ever so slightly glowing beaded necklace around his neck could be seen. "Who's this?" One of the 4 men, with a shrill, annoying voice and 3 blue markings running vertically up his face, asked to his friends. "Nobody important, just an interloper. Setsuna, deal with him." It was the apparent leader of the group, probably the only normal-looking one with long white hair, that spoke. However, the man on the edge with long, spiked-out blue hair and equally odd facial marking was the one that nodded, a look of eagerness entering his black, dilated eyes. Certainly Kusana. Naruto's eyebrow actually quirked up in amusement as a small wall of shuriken flew straight at him, creating a whine in the air as they sliced through it, aided by wind chakra. However, all four men's eyes widened when every single kunai simply stopped 2 meters before hitting Naruto, harmlessly clattering to the wooden floor. Excuse me, I was looking for the priestess of this shrine, someone called Shion, I believe. If the apparent invisible wall around the blonde hadn't shocked them, the ease with which he completely ignored the attempt on his life certainly did. At this point even Shion wasn't able to maintain her emotionless facade and shakily raised her hand. She was very in tune with chakra and she felt it rushing from this odd teen-like waves breaking through a flimsy dam. That's me. Naruto just smiled congenially as he walked into the room, making the 4 ninja take an involuntary step back, some of them reaching for kunai and shuriken, the others placing their hands into seals. Naruto completely ignored them as he walked straight through their number, stopping a moment to bow before Shion. I'm honored the lady of this shrine would allow me access. Shion blinked, finding words coming from her mouth in well-practiced sentences before she even knew what was happening. I am humbled by your honor and gladly accept it, traveler. Naruto looked up from his bow with a kindly, compassionate smile that completely set Shion off guard. How could anybody be so completely serene in a situation like this? Apparently the 4 ninja felt the same as the blonde suddenly found a hand intruding on his personal space belonging to the one with the 3 vertical blue lines on their face. Oi kid, what's your problem, can't you see we're busy? However, the orange-haired man quickly stumbled back as he felt the chakra suddenly leave his body, the facial markings fading from his face fading away to reveal pale skin. His now normal eyes widened as he looked at his own hand in shock, his companions mirroring the expression. What's going on? The chakra is gone. From in front of them they saw Naruto turn to them, grimacing as a deep violet chakra casually steamed off from his hand like a fine mist. I won't be doing that again. Whatever the chakra is you are using to augment your bodies is positively vile. The leader of the group of 4 scowled at the monk as the last of the chakra vented from his hand to harmlessly disperse in the air. How dare you impugn the gift from Yomi-sama? The white-haired shinobi rushed forward, strange purple snake-like creatures bursting from his back as he moved to attack the blonde. Naruto just stood there calmly, the serenity draining from his face to be replaced by pure neutrality as he raised one hand. It's rude to enter the chambers of a priestess without invitation. Kusana felt like he had run into an unyielding, invisible wall as he came to a sudden, grinding halt in front of Naruto. It only lasted a moment though before he felt his chest collapse as an enormous, unseen force suddenly launched him from the room. He flew back like an arrow from a bow, making his companions' robes flutter in the breeze he created as he shot past. He couldn't even scream as all the air had been violently forced from his lungs. Kusana. His companions stared in shock at the small black dot flying through the temple grounds away from them, vanishing out of sight below the stairs leading up to the priestess' chambers. Then, one by one, they turned to look at Naruto who was still gazing at them with that indifferent, emotionless expression he borrowed from Fu. Leave. The ninja didn't need a second opportunity, turning tail and darting straight out of the open doors, only briefly stopping to grab their comrade from the deep trench his body had dug. Naruto watched them go as his emotionless facade finally dissolved. He couldn't understand how Fu could hold it for so long, practice he would guess. Why did you let them escape? The young monk turned, his serene expression back, to face the young priestess. However, he decided to ignore her for now, quickly striding over to the man lying in front of her, bleeding out of a large wound on his back that looked incredibly serious. Shion frowned at the casual dismissal of her question, shifting into a seiza position as she looked at the young blonde sternly. Normally a young girl of only 15 couldn't manage that look, however her cold violet eyes and regal bearing made it quite intimidating. I asked you a question, monk-san. Naruto just waved her off, making the girl's eyes widen before gaining a tick mark on her brow. She had never been completely ignored like this before. I said I asked you a question, monk. She put more emphasis into her words, however she was a little surprised when Naruto simply turned his head, leveling an equally stern look back at her, his rippled eyes bringing the point across even better. And I'm afraid I have to ignore you, Miko-sama. This man requires medical attention more than you need an instant answer. And just like that, Naruto turned back to the man, palm glowing green with healing chakra as he ran it back and forth over the wound. Shion only took a moment to get over her shock before looking up haughtily, nose in the air as she looked down at the monk. There is no point, he will die. I foresaw it. Naruto only frowned as the green flicker died around his hands. She was right, the man's spine had been completely severed. In fact, the only thing keeping him alive was the angle at which he lay. Naruto's hand lit up in green flames again as he allowed it to hover over the man's injury. I already told you it was Poin. Shion was shocked again when Naruto simply raised a hand, effectively silencing the priestess. I know, I am simply easing his pain. No reason he has to die in agony, is there? As if to corroborate that the injured man let out a relieved sigh. It would turn out to be his last as a few moments later his chest rose and fell for the final time. Naruto knelt there for a few moments, saying nothing as he observed the dead man before reaching across and gently closing his eyes, shifting high body into a more dignified position. It would be almost a minute of this stifling silence before the young man who had been standing beside Shion throughout the entire encounter finally spoke up. Monk-san. Naruto at first gave no visible reaction, but after a moment or two he stood up, releasing a small breath he had been holding as he turned his rippled orbs on the young priestess and her attendant. Yes. The man was a little shocked at the casual answer from the teen but recovered quickly, giving a polite but sincere bow which made Naruto distinctly uncomfortable. I would like to formally thank you for your aid in repelling those intruders to this shrine and would ask if there was anything I could do in return. A small smile quirked on Naruto's lips as he quietly shook his head in return. This time he didn't surprise the pair, after all monks were naturally modest. That won't be necessary, although someplace warm for me and my friends to stay the night would be appreciated. Taruho quickly nodded before pausing, glancing to either side of Naruto as if trying to see somebody that was hiding in plain sight. Naruto just smiled amused as he realized what he had just said. My friends are helping to quell the various fires outside, they should be here shortly. Taruho just nodded again before reaffirming his features into a more professional tone. Now Monk-san, I assume there was a reason for your visit to our humble shrine. Perhaps to pay your respects to Shion-sama. Naruto chuckled softly at that, taking Taruho aback at the assumed slight at the young priestess. However, Naruto quickly caught his error. He still wasn't very good with the manners and formalities needed for such an auspicious audience. I meant no disrespect, I merely laughed because you seem to underestimate yourself. The small village I stayed in last night spoke very highly of the shrine here. They told me it had brought Oni no Kuni and even the surrounding lands nothing but good luck for the past few centuries. Taruho merely looked at the monk blankly before nodding slowly, already wondering just how many strange encounters they were scheduled for today. Answer my question, monk. It seemed Shion had finally had enough of being left out of the conversation, speaking up in her irritation even if it didn't show through her clipped and proper tone. Why did you let those men escape? You clearly showed the capacity to detain them. They may pose a threat to me in the future. Naruto turned almost laboriously solely towards the young priestess, smiling serenely. I am afraid I am not a shinobi Miko-sama, merely a wandering monk. It is outside my authority to detain criminals, especially when I do not know what their crimes were. Shion's face remained perfectly poised, however the hint of irritation that entered her eyes was as clear to Naruto that she might as well have scowled. It seemed the monk was mocking her in some way, yet he was being incredibly subtle about it. What she didn't know was that Naruto had already made a fairly strong opinion of the girl from her lack of care for her subordinate's death and her complete disregard for a dying man's ease of passing. Almost as if she saw no value in the life of another human being. He hoped that wasn't the case, but she was creating that impression. You still should have done something, monk. Naruto just smiled softly, irking Shion that he wasn't rising to her taunt like she wanted. I apologize, Miko-sama. Next time I will both save your life and capture the attackers. Shion snorted derisively but still somehow managed to make it seem poised and collected. You were unnecessary. Taruho here was perfectly ready to offer his life to buy me the time to escape. To emphasize this, she gently pushed the panel on the wall behind her bed, revealing it to be a small passage to be used in the case of emergency. However, Naruto's eyes darkened a little at the casual comment, his tone becoming slightly icier. Well then, I think it was a good thing I came along then, isn't it, Taruho-san? As he spoke, his eyes never left Shion. The priestess though was looking away haughtily, finally glad to get some kind of reaction from the monk. The attendant quickly spotted the brewing tension and quickly hurried forward, patting Naruto on the shoulder gently but insistently. "Very well, Monk-san, Naruto just smiled kindly, his previous icy tone all but gone as his eyes crinkled into fox-like slits. Naruto Uzumaki." Taruho nodded quickly, still leading Naruto from the room with his hand on the younger teen's shoulder. "Yes, Naruto, I will show you and your companions to a room shortly, for now I ask you wait outside while I discuss something with Shien-sama." The blonde nodded with a shrug, seeing no harm in it as he was quickly led from the room, probably for the best. Even Buddha can only forgive 3 times and Shien was certainly pushing that 3rd time. Taruho let out a relieved, but hidden sigh as he slid shut the simple, but elegant paper door to Shien's room, turning back to the priestess. "Taruho, why are you allowing him to stay here?" The attendant smiled sheepishly, used to Shien's mood swings by now. "He did save your life, Shien-sama, a room for the night is little to pay in return." The girl simply huffed condescendingly, however Taruho knew better. He knew there was a scared, lonely little girl inside of her that couldn't bear to connect with anybody emotionally thanks to the rough, isolated childhood her powers as Oni no Kuni's priestess gave her. "Very well, what of Konoha then? Has there been any word on the shinobi they promised us? I still require an escort to Numa no Kuni." At that Taruho winced, that had been the news he was bringing to the priestess when the 4 shinobi had attacked. "I'm afraid their aid is impossible at the moment, Shien-sama." The pale blonde-haired girl's eyes widened in surprise at that. She didn't think much of shinobi before, but they had paid a substantial amount for that escort mission. Sealing off Moryu's body was essential. Did they not understand the gravity of this situation? If Moryu were to return. She trailed off, shuddering at the thought as she remembered the various stories her mother had told her as a little girl of just what it was the Miko of Oni no Kuni protected the world from. Taruho simply nodded gravely. There wasn't a single resident of Oni no Kuni that didn't know the stories of the great demon Moryu. "I'm afraid there was some kind of attack on Konoha. They have had to recall all shinobi for its defense." Shien scowled openly in the presence of her most trusted attendant. This was quite literally the worst possible time for this to happen. "We must simply move out with a contingent of your own guards. We should be enough to defend against those ruffian shinobi." Shien said nothing, but her eyes narrowed slightly in thought, hiding the grimace that came over her face. "You are right, Taruho." The man looked up, a little surprised at the compliment. Shien rarely gave them. "We will just have to rely on the resources that are on hand." Naruto stared up at the interwoven beams that made up his room's ceiling in contemplation. He had come to Oni no Kuni in hopes of finding some information on the Biju, and the residents of the town they first stayed at had directed them here, speaking high praises of the priestess. However, all he had found so far was an arrogant, cold girl that knew nothing of the value of a human life, disregarding the sacrifices of her attendants like they had no meaning. Like they were disposable from the very beginning, kept around for no reason other than to die in her place. His thoughts were derailed though when Fu, sleeping soundly next to him, moved in her sleep, squeezing the arm she had firmly over his chest as she snuggled into his warmth. He just smiled, bringing a hand up to move a stray bang away from her face to reveal the light smile adorning her face. He loved when the mint-haired girl slept. Her face became so honest, no mask or emotionless facade for her to hide behind. There was also the fact that she would make the cutest little noises to herself when she slept, murmuring to herself over whatever dreams were running through her mind. Once again though his thoughts were sent veering off as the door to their room opened a crack. Almost instantly Fu's eyes shot open, breaking the flimsy boundary between dreams and reality as she had been trained to do. "No need to worry, girl that travels with the monk, it is just me." Naruto's eyebrow raised a little as Shien slipped into the room, closing the door gently behind her, not because she was there, but because of what she was wearing. Instead of her Miko regalia she had instead donned simply civilian clothing of a plain white short stopping just above her midsection and red shorts that had been rolled up to just beneath her knees. Over that she wore a yellow jacket that was just a little too long for her, evidenced by the sleeves covering her hands. Finally, instead of the crown-like diadem she had worn, her hair was now done up in a ponytail that only tied up the ends of her long hair, leaving the rest to billow out. "Miko-sama, it's a pleasure." Naruto gave a curt nod of his head with only the slightest of mocking tones to his voice. He felt as though he had been a little hasty in making his impression of the girl, so he decided for a new start. Or at least he did, until the girl huffed, looking up and peering down her nose at him. "Don't be so foolish, monk, this is not a matter of pleasure." At that she trailed off, looking down at where Fu still sat protectively next to Naruto. The mint-haired girl was warily eyeing the newcomer. "I had thought monks to be celibate, or you as lenient with the other tenets of that life." Naruto just smiled amusedly, placing a hand around Fu's shoulders, surprising but not displeasing the Jinchuriki. "My master was very understanding when it came to matters of the heart. I see no reason for the life I have chosen and the path I walk to exclude love." At that a hint of red crept over the bridge of Fu's nose, but to her credit she didn't look down from warily eyeing the pale blonde-haired girl. Xian was a little ruffled by Naruto's comment, having once again hoped to get a rise from him, however she hid it expertly as usual. In any case you should pack what little you have with you. You are to escort me to Numa no Kuni." Naruto blinked once, then twice as an odd, tense silence came over the room. It made Xian feel a little uneasy as she found herself unable to tear her gaze from his deep, rippled orbs. "Could I ask why?" Fu looked around at the blonde incredulously, surprised he was actually considering this sudden and rather outrageous order. She had never known the monk to be one to easily follow the given orders of anybody. Xian simply sighed with obviously exaggerated annoyance. "If you must, I am to perform an ancient sealing ritual to strengthen the seals placed on the body of an immeasurably powerful demon named Moryu. Those 4 shinobi were underlings of the man attempting to resurrect the demon, and I will require protection from them and any other danger that might prevent me in this task. Should I fail, this land and all the others will come under a kingdom of darkness for 1,000 years. Again the room descended into complete silence as Xian and Naruto continued to stare at one another, unblinkingly before, finally, Naruto shrugged. "Okay." Xian finally broke their staring contest as she blinked in surprise, a large part of her expecting the monk to simply say no. After all, he was under no obligation of any kind to help her. She hadn't even talked about a reward for potentially risking their lives yet. "Okay." Naruto just nodded, standing up and making Xian blush almost unnoticeably as she finally realized the monk was only wearing his baggy brown pants, revealing his toned, muscled chest. Fu glared at the girl coldly as her violet orbs raked over the young teen's sculpted features until she stopped, feeling the Jinchuriki's eyes boring into the side of her head. "Sure. I have a lot to do in my lifetime. 1,000 years of darkness under the rule of a demon would be a little inconveniencing." Xian stared dumbly at the blonde for a few more moments, processing what he had just said so casually. Naruto simply used the time to throw on his clothing and tie back his hair. Fu did the same with only a small amount of reluctance. She had been enjoying her sleep, but she knew once Naruto had made up his mind there was little that would, or could stop him. "What, just like that?" Naruto simply looked around, tying his forehead protector into place with an amused glint in his eye. "Why not?" Xian struggled to come up with an answer, even as her mind asked itself why it needed one. Naruto was giving her exactly what she wanted without even asking for anything in return, so why was that giving her so much pause? "However, I would ask why me and not the many guards and attendants you have already waiting on you, ready to protect you?" Xian was caught a little off guard by the sudden question, but she recovered admirably, pointing her nose up derisively. "They would only hold me back. My attendants and even Taruho are no match for those shinobi. However, you have proven that you are able to defend yourself and even counter them, so you are the best option." Naruto was silent for a moment, eyes searching Xian's face before a smile crept over his lips. "And I assume you are asking me in the middle of the night as your attendants, and Taruho would disagree with these statements?" "Quite vehemently, I would imagine." Xian became flustered again as Naruto continued to dance around the topic even after he had already said he would do it. "That does not matter, they would only hold me back and get themselves killed in the process." The room was silent as Xian's eyes widened, realizing what she had just let slip in her little outburst. Naruto only allowed his smile to grow a little as he nodded his head once, now fully clothed again. "I see." Xian glared at the boy, the little voice in her head telling her she was showing too much of her emotions being ignored. "You see nothing, monk. Now hurry up and gather your belongings, we leave right away." With that the girl stormed out of the room, still being quiet so as not to wake her attendants. When the door was shut behind her, Naruto finally released the chuckle that had been building in his throat, making Fu look at him oddly. What was that about? Naruto simply sighed amusedly as he looked off in the direction Shion had gone. It seems I judged our priestess a little too early. Come on, we need to go and wake Yuya and Haku. Fu nodded hesitantly, glad for the change in topic, although waking up the volatile redhead this early wasn't exactly a calming prospect. Okay, let me get this straight. Naruto sighed as he heard Yuya begin her obligatory rant about what they were doing. No amount of preparing for it would make it pass any easier. The four of them, plus Shion, had left the temple sometime around midnight, while the moon hung at the center of the sky. From there they had made steady progress through the forests of Oni no Kuni under Shion's directions. We're heading to this swamp place to seal away the body of a big-ass ancient demon because some idiots are planning on resurrecting him. Naruto nodded slowly. So far Yuya didn't seem to be angry, just very, very tired if her bedraggled state of her hair was anything to go on. Unsurprisingly, Yuya was not a morning person, and that showed from her generally irritable and grumpy attitude as they walked along. It is called Numa no Kuni, get the name right you cretin. Yuya growled lowly, like some wild animal, but said nothing as Shion berated her. Naruto shouldn't have been surprised that the normally proper and dignified Shion and the volatile and irritable Yuya didn't get along. However, Shion seemed to have moved her annoyance at not getting a rise from Naruto onto the poor redhead who, unfortunately, was very easy to rile up. Right, Numa no Kuni, big-ass demon, resurrecting idiots. Anyway, we're going there because this brat. Shion scowled at the girl, but in quite possibly the most dignified way one could imagine, making it appear more like a condescending sneer. Told us that if she doesn't perform some kind of convenient as all hell seal over the demon's body, then the world will fall under some 1,000 years of darkness crap. Naruto put a finger to his chin in thought for a moment as they walked before nodding once. Sounds right. Yuya nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly but still not showing any genuine irritation. Okay, I get all that. Crazier shit than that's bound to happen around you. I even get why you believed her, you always were the soft and mushy type. Hell, I don't even care why we're the ones taking the brat. Shion scowled again, but her weak protests over the fact she was only a few years younger than Yuya went ignored. As opposed to her legions of guards, attendants and soldiers. Naruto nodded, waiting for Yuya to get to her point as they followed a winding stream that would supposedly take them towards the border of the country. Just one thing though. Naruto paused, turning to the redhead to see that she had gained numerous tick marks across her brow and her eye was twitching quite violently. Yes. Yuya's eye twitched again in response to the casual reply, glaring weakly at the blonde as her long hair oddly fell across her face to shadow her eyes. Why the fuck am I the one that has to carry her? Everybody in the group winced as the redhead's shrill scream echoed through the forest, causing birds to scatter from the trees and more than a few animals to look up in shock before scampering away. Once Naruto had calmly taken his fingers out of his ear, he just smiled at the redhead congenially. You were the last one up. Yuya scowled at him, starting to loathe the fact that she struggled to get up in the mornings. It wasn't her fault. She was 18, being lazy in the mornings was in her rights. Fine, but why do we have to carry you at all? This time the question was directed up, to the passenger on her back. And where the fuck are your shoes anyway? Shion didn't even look down at the former Oto Kunoichi, looking up at the sky haughtily. I'm afraid I don't speak to foul-mouthed cretins like you. Yuya's eye twitched again as she seriously contemplated just dropping the girl off a cliff, or a volcano if she could find one. Where are your shoes? Miko-sama. Yuya ground it out through gritted teeth as Shion smirked at her superiorly for a moment before huffing, looking away into the forest at nothing in particular. I spent my entire life in the temple, only ever venturing out into the village to simply walk around. I was never required to have shoes, so I never got any. Naruto gained a sad smile in his position at the front of the group, not that anybody could see it. That must have been lonely. Shion faltered for a moment, staring at the back of the other blonde's head incredulously for a few seconds before collecting herself, snorting derisively. What would you know, monk? Naruto simply remained silent as they walked on, letting the group descend into a slightly awkward silence, not for long though. Hey, you should have some spare shoes she could borrow, right femboy? Haku lightly growled at the jab on his masculinity, so what if he had more shoes than the rest of the group, combined? He enjoyed a certain standard of comfort and they tended to travel a lot. Oh yeah, and about the right size too. Haku growled again before realizing something and gaining a smirk of his own. So you are saying you have big feet? Yuya just snorted, a little disappointed with the weak retort. Says the most feminine person in a group with 3 girls. Haku just narrowed his eyes again as Shion had to suppress a small giggle at the soft-featured boy's reaction. She had never experienced friendly banter in a group like this before. It was amusing. However, it didn't take her long to realize Yuya had just insulted her as well. Hey, you take that back, you uncouth cretin. She pounded Yuya in the back, making the redhead's eye twitch again as a positively evil smirk overcame her features. Right, that's it. Shion yelped in surprise as Yuya suddenly released the grip she had on the girl's legs, letting her tumble ungracefully to the dirty ground. From the front of the group, Naruto merely sighed in amusement as he came to a stop, looking around the small clearing they had entered. Well, I suppose this is as good a place to stop as any. He looked back to where Shion was now picking herself up off the floor, glaring daggers at Yuya. Unless of course you think we haven't traveled far enough away from your attendants. Shion glared for a few more seconds at the redhead before turning to Naruto, muttering something under her breath. No, my attendants will not notice my absence until the change in guard at around 9 in the morning. Only Taruho might suspect something before then, but I managed to slip something into his tea before he went to sleep. He shouldn't wake up until midday tomorrow. Naruto just raised an amused eyebrow at that as he felt a new chakra signature enter the area, looking off into the trees in the direction they had come from. I would not be too sure that Shion-sama. The priestess turned to the forest in surprise as a single figure emerged from the shadows cast by the tree line. Taruho. Chapter 69, Clouds Part 7. I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past. Thomas Jefferson. Taruho. Shion was shocked at the appearance of her attendant before a scowl shot across her face, her hands clenching into fists. You idiot. What are you doing here? She stormed towards the kindly-looking man, fists raised up in front of her to pound on his chest petulantly. However, she didn't make it more than 3 steps before a sudden invisible force seemed to wrap around her entire body, wrenching her back quickly, but not uncomfortably so. She could only look up in shock as she found herself in the arms of Naruto, at least until he set her to the side gently. I would not do that, Miko-sama. Shion only took a moment to get over her brief confusion, a new scowl sliding across her face as she stared angrily up at the other blonde. What are you doing, monk? I may not have wanted Taruho here. She sent a glare at the man that had him sheepishly rubbing the back of his head, as he would be nothing but a burden to us, however he is still my attendant. Naruto's face remained unchanged though as he stared evenly at the young man, Rinnegan eyes unblinkingly watching his form. No, he isn't. The brown-haired man adjusted his glasses with a look of confusion evident across his kindly features. I am confused, monk-san. He shook his head quickly, a seemingly genuinely perplexed look on his face as he looked over to Shion. I am merely Taruho, attendant to Shion-sama. I only wish to bring her back to the safety of her guards and attendants. His gaze hardened slightly, surprising Shion as she had never seen Taruho express anything remotely resembling a stern loom before. The priestess should not be traveling with escorts that are not of her personal guard. Slowly he drew the sword out of the sheath on his back, holding it confidently out in front of him like a true samurai. Taruho. What are you doing? Shion couldn't believe her eyes. Taruho had always been a man to peacefully settle things first, never to begin with violence as a means to an end. Ignore him, Miko-sama, he is not your attendant. The paler blonde looked around, staring up into Naruto's rippled eyes for a few seconds as Taruho continued to point his sword threateningly in their direction. Why do you keep saying that? How can you be so sure? Naruto simply smiled softly at the younger blonde as he gestured off in a seemingly random direction from the clearing. Because he is. A blurry form suddenly stumbled into the clearing, revealing the panting and slightly sweaty form of the real Taruho, looking incredibly out of breath from both his sprint here and from whatever Shion had put into his drink. Shion-sama. He is an imposter. The pale-haired girl just stared at the 2 identical men for a few moments before taking a hesitant step back towards Naruto. The monk simply looked between the 2 before smirking at the first of the men to catch up to them. It's a good henge, I'll admit, but my eyes aren't so easily fooled. The first Taruho's kindly smile quickly devolved into a scowl as his features melted away, revealing the white-haired man that Naruto could have sworn he sent into a trench earlier, Kusuna. Well, that was to be expected, I suppose. You are strong after all. He glanced about the clearing before grinning cruelly. Now, faster than any civilian could have possibly reacted, or even seen, the 3 other men of the gang of 4 that had assaulted Shien's temple leapt from the trees. Luckily Naruto was no civilian and with a disinterested glance simply widened his eyes a little. Almost immediately the 3 shinobi found their jump stopped by some invisible barrier keeping them suspended in the sky, but only for a split moment. Shinra Tensei. All of a sudden the 3 other men of the group found out just what had happened to Kusuna back at the temple as they were forcibly expelled from the area by invisible blasts of pure gravitational force. However, all Shien or the other members of Naruto's group felt were slight breezes from the powerful technique. The white-haired leader of the quartet simply stared at the monk in shock, disbelieving that he could so casually get rid of his 3 dark chakra-empowered companions without even moving. What are you? He took a hesitant step back from the younger blonde as Naruto looked around, leveling a steady, unwavering stare at the servant of Moryu. I don't know what you mean, Shinobi-san. I am nothing more than a simple monk. When he finished speaking he smiled kindly, his eyes narrowing into unnervingly innocent slits. Kusuna just took another step back, his eyes widened with fear now. It was like some unspeakably horrific entity had just appeared behind Naruto, like a great hyena mask that stared at him as a visage of pure terror. Why, you're not human. The white-haired shinobi darted from the clearing suddenly in a shunshin, his movements nothing but a blur of motion. However, Naruto's eyes followed him anyway even as he lazily raised a hand in the man's direction. Bansho Tenin. There was a moment's pause before the white-haired shinobi's surprised and fearful yell echoed in the clearing. Not a second later he had flown back towards the group, landing roughly in a trench by Naruto's feet, black eyes locked on the teen's form with fear. Naruto though simply maintained his innocent, kindly smile as he gently crouched down, making sure to look the man in the eyes. You know, I would very much appreciate it if you and your companions would stop attacking us. We have something very important to do and it is more of an inconvenience than anything. Kusuna just continued to stare up at him, his breathing ragged, his body felt paralyzed as he stared up into those deep, ringed eyes, as if he were drowning in them. All right. Naruto just nodded happily even though the air was still tense as if at any moment the entire clearing would just explode. All right then, you can go now. It seemed Kusuna needed no further encouraging as he scrambled to his feet, once again darting from the area without so much as a backwards glance at the group. There was a few moments of terse silence before Naruto turned, bearing a more genuine, but no less intimidating smile as he casually walked through the group. Shall we continue on then? The group stared at him oddly for a few moments, especially Taruho and Shien, but after a few seconds of deliberating, or in Fu's case not a moment's hesitation, they followed after him. So you are saying you failed me? The 4 shinobi knelt in front of a regal-looking tent, big enough for one person. The man that sat inside on an intricate seat fit for a king looked pallid and unhealthy, his dark hair slick on his sweaty skin as he spoke with a wavering, croaky voice. However, his eyes were deep and dark, burning with energy and power as he glared at his subordinates. You couldn't even bring me a single, weak little priestess. The 4 kneeling shinobi flinched at his harsh tone, as if his voice was wavering between 2 different speakers. Finally Kusuna gathered up his courage and looked up, only to immediately regret it as he felt the force of his master's chakra bear down on his like a physical presence. It was the monk Yomi-sama. He was too powerful for us. Yomi simply glared at the man who dared to say the power he had bestowed them wasn't enough for a single, lowly monk. He was about to rebuke the man before a low, whispering voice in the recesses of his mind convinced him otherwise. He grunted irritably instead. What monk? Kusuna let out a deep, relieved breath at not being torn apart before looking up again, avoiding looking into his master's dark, unwavering eyes. He didn't look special, but he has great power. He could send us flying away from him without even moving, using strange techniques I have never heard of. Yomi's eyes narrowed as the whispering voice in his mind became louder, more demanding. What was the name of this technique? Kusuna frowned, wondering what his master's fascination with this monk was. He was powerful, but in the shinobi's mind there was nobody stronger than Yomi, especially as he bore the spirit of Moryu within him. He racked his mind for a moment, trying to think what he had heard from the boy as he casually blasted his companions away with ease. It was Shinra Tensai. Yomi's eyes widened for a split second before grasping his head in pain, crying out as the whispering voice became more of a scream. The four shinobi saw their master's distress and were about to get to their feet to see what was wrong when his eyes snapped open again, effectively freezing them all in place. His eyes weren't human anymore, the dark of his iris having spread to the entirety of his eyes, giving him a demonic visage. So they have resurfaced again. His voice was raspy and disjointed, like it wasn't quite his own. However, the moment passed and a second later Yomi blinked and his eyes were his own again. He shook his head, wincing at the loud voice in the dark of his mind screamed at him. He looked up when he realized he had been silent for a good minute and the four shinobi were staring at him with worry and confusion. Go, destroy the priestess. Do not fail me or Moryu-sama again. Kusuna nodded hesitantly as the other three shinobi darted off, glad to be away from their master while he was in this mood. However, the white-haired medic Nin hesitated for a moment. Yomi-sama, what do we do about the monk? The dark-haired man looked up, still looking incredibly sickly, despite the enormous waves of power radiating off him. Nothing, when the time comes I will deal with him myself, just make sure that if they reach the sealing ground, he enters alone. His glare intensified as Kusuna felt a cold sweat break out over his form. The others are expendable, do you understand me? Do what you have to but make sure the monk is alone. Kusuna quickly nodded, taking a step back from the glaring man. Of course Yomi-sama. And with that he vanished from in front of the tent in a blur of motion, leaving the possessed man to his thoughts and machinations. Slowly Yomi's face slid into a sickening grin as darkness once again overtook his eyes, a thin mist of potent purple chakra radiating off his body. Yes, this is perfect. Naruto sat quietly on the edge of a large canyon just staring out over the rushing waters far below him. The sky was dark overhead now, so the group had decided to set up camp, and much to the protests of Shion that had included Taruho. Despite her claims he was simply a burden and would slow them down, considering the fact that they were just walking to Numa no Kuni, he didn't slow them down at all. In fact, the young attendant had been rather worried they wouldn't make it in time. Naruto had simply told him to have faith in the sealing abilities of Shion's mother. Ah, Monk-san. Naruto didn't make a sound as the very same attendant came walking up beside him, sitting down next to the blonde and staring at him for a few moments. Yes, Taruho. How could I help you? The brown-haired man faltered for a moment at the peaceful and serene tone the young teen used. It sounded so out of place on somebody so young, as if belonging to a much older, wiser man. I would like to apologize for Shion-sama's behavior towards you and your friends. She has a hard time voicing her gratitude and... The man trailed off as Naruto absently lifted a hand, placing it on his shoulder and quietening him for the moment. There is no need for you to apologize on her behalf, Taruho. The attendant looked around in slight confusion at the blonde, making the teen chuckle. You might just think of me as a teenager, or a sheltered monk, but trust me, I understand. He sighed, the humor leaving his voice as he stared out over the water raging below them, so contrasting to the perfectly still night air. Shion had a very lonely childhood, didn't she? Taruho's eyes widened in surprise, but he nodded all the same, his own tone becoming somber as he thought back to the early days when he first became Shion's personal attendant. Lady Shion, like all the priestesses of Oni no Kuni before her, has the limited ability to see into the future. At that, Naruto raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He could hardly talk when it came to strange, otherworldly abilities that should be impossible. She gained small glimpses into the future of those around her, allowing her to see their deaths before they happened with 100% accuracy. This time it was Naruto's eyes that widened before his face darkened a little, his eyes turning down. And let me guess, people avoided her, fearing that she would foresee their deaths. They would stay away from her because of a power she had from birth that she had no control over having. Taruho looked up, still surprised by this strange, oddly understanding monk. Yes. Other children were warned away from her by their parents out of fear, and despite the respect they had for her and her mother, they didn't want to risk her abilities turning on them. Taruho frowned, seeing very familiar look in the blonde's eyes he recognized from back when Shion wasn't so good at concealing her emotions. You speak of all this as though from experience, monk-san. Naruto looked back round, the mirth back in his eyes as he concealed his previous slip with a small smile. Thank you Taruho, I think I understand better now. Languidly he stood up, stretching out his back as he looked up at the twinkling stars above them. But we should be getting back, it is late and we have a long journey ahead of us tomorrow. He looked down, seeing that Taruho was staring at him with just a hint of worry in his eyes. You shouldn't worry so much Taruho, it'll add years to your face, we'll pick up the pace tomorrow, I swear. With that the young blonde turned and walked back towards the camp, leaving Taruho alone to look out over the valley before he too stood and returned to his rightful place by Shien's side. Ah, no, put me down, this is too fast, ah. Shien's screams and wails of protests were only slightly muffled by the raging river that could be heard nearby as the group dashed quickly across the forest floor. Behind them Taruho valiantly struggled to keep up with them, but Naruto made sure their pace was slow enough for him to stay with the group. However, despite the obvious exertion it put on the man, he never spoke out, merely running along with stoic silence, ever alert for dangers to Shien. The priestess on the other hand wasn't nearly as quiet over her discomfort, still riding along of Tayuya's back, who, once again, was the last one. Up. Pipe down thoroughbred, you're going to scare off the birds with those banshee cries. Shien could only manage a small glare before he was forced to grab tightly onto the redhead's shoulders as Tayuya jumped clear across a small valley. Ah, slow down or put me down. She was having to shout over the winds rushing past them as the group continued to sprint through the thick forest. Tayuya just grinned viciously, having had nearly enough of being screamed at for the entire morning, although a part of her was rather impressed Shien had managed to keep shouting for this long. Oh, I'll put you down all right if you keep screaming at me, princess. Shien blanched a little as she glanced down at the forest floor rushing by beneath the redhead's feet, almost a blur to her untrained eyes. Taruho. Taruho, help me. This maniac is going to drop me. Taruho. However, it wasn't Taruho that appeared next to the two girls, instead it was Naruto, calmly placing a hand on Tayuya's shoulder as they came to a stop next to a large oak tree. It's all right Tayuya, I'll carry her for a bit. The redhead didn't even argue, simply shrugging the blonde priestess off her back, much to the girl's surprise as she suddenly fell towards the earth. However, before she could painfully land on her back she felt a hand grab hers. When she opened her eyes from her wince she saw Naruto smiling kindly at her. The blonde quickly slung her onto his back in on-smooth motion, making the priestess blush as she found her arms now wrapping around his lean but muscled chest. What are you doing? She found her voice suddenly losing its confidence as she tried to withdraw into her jacket, looking oddly like a turtle as she did so. Come on, we need to catch up with the group. Shien just nodded, doing her best to fight back the blush spreading over her features as Naruto took off to catch up to the others. In contrast to Tayuya's rougher, bumpier sprint, the Miko found Naruto to be a much more comfortable ride. He just seemed to glide along the ground like it was ice, and even the wind rushing by didn't seem to bother them, as if it were being bent around their forms. However, after a few minutes she broke out of her reverie over her new chauffeur's carrying ability as she noticed they hadn't caught up to the group yet. Monk. Naruto just nodded slowly, his eyes darting about as he reached out with his senses through the moisture in the air. I know, don't worry about them. In truth, Shien hadn't been thinking about the others, but for some reason she didn't want to disappoint the blonde, so she said nothing. You can come out now. However, the blonde's only answer was a sudden attack from below as those same sickly-looking purple snakes burst from the ground attempting to ensnare him and the priestess. In a blur of motion though he vanished from between the entwining creatures, appearing up on a tree branch as he gently let Shien down and turned to her in a crouch. Stay up here, I'll be right back. He jumped back down to the forest floor just in time to land on one of the fleshy snakes, crushing its head beneath his sandal. So confident, however I know your abilities now, monk. You won't defeat me so easily, I'm afraid. The voice seemed to echo out around the small clearing, surrounding he blonde to confuse him. Kusuna was annoyed though when the monk's steely ringed eyes landed directly on him, even in his hiding place. You don't know anything of my abilities. Kusuna only had time to widen his eyes and leap back before a great fist of sand came down to crush the branch he had been hiding on. Strange blue vein-like marking lined the sandy hand, which is all the shinobi saw before it harmlessly dispersed into particles. He realized too late it had been a diversion. Before he was sent rocketing back by a great invisible blast that shook his bones and launched him though more than a few trees. A moment later Naruto landed in the crater his body had dug, watching as the shinobi picked himself up, bones and skin knitting together even as he watched. You can't defeat me, monk. Moryu-sama's gift flows through me. No matter what damage you do I will simply heal from it. Naruto gained a serene but intimidating smile as he began casually rolling up the sleeves of his open robe, not wanting to dirty it as he only had the one. Okay, let's test that. Fu sighed in irritation as she leapt from the ground, watching with mildly curious eyes when the earth beneath her split apart as a razor-sharp blade of water rushed through it. She recognized the technique from the Kiri Rebellion, Sweden, Mizukami-kiri. It was dangerous to those unprepared for it. However, to her eyes and reflexes it was almost painfully slow, even if the shinobi was using it in slightly creative ways. Underneath her the deadly blade of water suddenly doubled back, aiming to hit her when she touched back down. However, she didn't give it the chance as wings sprouted from her back at the zenith of her jump. If this is all the power you can bring, you might as well hold still and let me deal with you now. I have to get back to Naruto's side. As if answering her call, her opponent appeared on a tree branch across from her, the orange-haired one with the 3 vertical blue markings on his face like war paint. Such confidence and dedication. Fu frowned when she felt his eyes wandering over her body, grimacing as a tongue came out to lick his lips lecherously. Not to mention your abilities, so unique. Fu recollected her expression as her wings brought her lower to touchdown on a branch, folding back into nothingness. Her eyes narrowed as the man continued to stare at her body, her hands coming up to rush through a multitude of hand seals. Do you wish to see a true water technique? Her hands stopped as water from the air as well as what was left over from the man's last technique congealed behind her. Sweden. Koku no Jutsu. The gathering water behind her suddenly exploded upwards, confusing the orange-haired shinobi until that same water suddenly rained back down on him, now a dirty blackened color. He tried to avoid it, but it was like avoiding the rain, exactly like avoiding the rain in fact, and soon he was soaked in the surprisingly sticky black water. Hey, was that it, girly? Was that all your little technique could do? Get me a little wet. Fu just stared at him with cold, dispassionate eyes as she held her hand up in the tiger seal, a small orange flame appearing on her outstretched index finger. Yes, now disappear. She touched her finger down and the man could only watch with surprise as the black, tar-like substance suddenly caught alight. The flames washed over the area in an instant, giving him no time to dodge or come up with a counter, and soon even the sounds of his screaming were lost behind the roar of the inferno. After a minute or so Fu finally released the seal and the black water slowly vanished, taking the flames with it to reveal a blackened and scorched section of the forest as well as the shinobi lying at the center of it all. It's not enough, girly, why you can't stop Moryu-sama? He'll crush you all. The mint-haired Jinchuriki dropped down to where the man was twitching on the ground, covered in nasty burns and unable to move from the pain. His voice was choked and weak as he coughed pitifully from the smoke he had inhaled as he screamed. Fu merely stared at him coldly before walking off, leaving him there. She cared little for what happened to him as long as he was no longer a threat. Haku casually moved his head out of the way of the massive fists of the giant in front of him, backing up with his hands behind his back as he fluidly moved his body this way and that to avoid the powerful, but slow punches. He knew that even one of those blows landing on his body would be bad for him, despite his ability to heal himself if necessary. This was the man that had split up their group, attacking once Naruto had fell behind with Shien, crashing down like a meteor and causing the group to scatter or be caught up in the potent earth technique. Hold still, you little brat. Haku just raised an eyebrow as he skirted around the man again, appearing behind him faster than the man could follow. Speed had always been one of the ice user's greatest strengths, and it had been a large focus of his studies during the 3 years on the island. After all, his reserves were too low for senjutsu training and he couldn't allow himself to fall behind his companions. I believe that would defeat the purpose of dodging. The man he was fighting, he believed his name was Gitai. If his semi-intelligible scream at the beginning of their fight was anything to go on, was like a berserker. Haku had to admit that while his attacks were slow they were undoubtedly powerful, able to easily smash through trees with glancing blows. However, he was crazed and his pupils were heavily dilated, indicating some kind of performance enhancer or chakra boost. Haku knew that if he simply outlasted the man he would use up whatever stimulant he was using and drop from the backlash. It wasn't an ideal solution considering he wanted to check how his friends were doing, but even after all this time he disliked violence. PFF'd, running like a little girl, pathetic. Fight me, you coward. Haku almost laughed but maintained his cold outward expression, if the man though he was going to rise to a simple taunt. Damn it, hold still. I hate fighting girls, they never know how to fight properly. Haku's rational mind came to a grinding halt. Contrary to what people might think, he was actually very sensitive over his appearance, or at least he had become that way after so long of having to Yuya taunt him. Suddenly Gitai noticed the air becoming colder around him, his breath becoming visible as he shivered. What did you call me? He looked up, seeing that Haku was looking down, his long hair hanging in front of his face, shadowing his eyes menacingly. Gitai shrugged off the sudden chill in the air, grinning as he cracked his knuckles, not noticing as Haku began to run through one-handed seals. Hey, did I strike a nerve, girly? The man grinned as he stepped forward, thinking his opponent had finally lost their nerve. In that he was unprepared as Haku finished his string of seals in a blur of finger movements that would have impressed the copy ninja. Hyoten, Samuk. Haku's voice went unheard as a whisper, but the thin layer of ice creeping over his hands didn't go unnoticed by the lumbering earth user. He caught the reflective gleam on the boy's hands and naturally tensed up for whatever technique he was about to use. Finally decided to fight serious, he froze mid-sentence, literally. Haku had vanished without even a blur, seemingly there one moment and gone the next. Over the next few seconds Gitai felt the numerous small pats as Haku dashed around him, occasionally tapping at his vital points. However, the gentle taps were far from harmless, and with every touch ice slipped off the boy's hands, creeping over Gitai's form in mere moments. When Haku finally reappeared to the visible eye, it was over and Gitai didn't even have time to cry out in surprise as the thin layer of chilling ice finished creeping over his entire body, freezing him there like a statue. I hate being called a girl. I'm just slightly feminine is all. Haku irritable blew a stray strand of hair from his face before stalking off, mumbling about irritating redheads as he disappeared into the foliage. Gitai just remained there, only able to move his eyes and breathe through the tiny gap in the ice Haku had left for his nose. He had a feeling he would be there for a while as he saw no sign of the ice beginning to melt under the sun. You call these shuriken? Fucking pathetic. Yuya taunted her own opponent as the two dashed through the trees. Sometimes the redhead would insult him further by casually running backwards. She would nimbly duck and weave as various shuriken, controlled by her opponent's wind technique, soared about her, trying to slice her up. She couldn't be bothered to remember his name, especially if he didn't even challenge her in the slightest. Seriously, is this the best you got? Her opponent, who she could tell was normally the quiet, stoic type, was getting more and more riled up by her casual taunting. Fuden. Kamikaze. Setsuna rushed through his hand seals, pausing on the ram as he exhaled a mighty breath. Yuya just raised an eyebrow as the huge gust of wind twisted and contorted until it had tuned into 3 great tornadoes of viciously rotating wind. The redhead simply grinned before the winds engulfed her, tearing at her body and causing arcs of her blood to become spattered on the trees they were racing through. Setsuna smirked as he saw his opponent be torn apart by his technique, at least until he heard he chuckling from somewhere behind him. That was it. Kami, you suck. He turned, wide-eyed as Yuya emerged from the trees behind him, casually leaning on the trunk of a great oak. You don't even realize how outclassed you really are, do you? Setsuna growled, feeling his stoic facade disappearing under this mere girl's onslaught of demeaning taunts. However, as he reached up to run through more hand seals, he found his arms immobilized. Looking down, he was shocked to see his arms bound by dark, demonic-looking chains that stretched off into the darkness of the tree line, a similar situation to his legs. Suddenly Yuya snapped her fingers and the chains went taut, painfully pulling at his limbs until he was awkwardly contorted into a spread eagle position. The redhead strode forward confidently, her long blood-colored hair flowing out behind her as horns seemed to sprout from her head, her eyes becoming a dark, menacing red. Idly she pulled a single, rather blunt-looking kunai from her kimono top and began picking at her nails with it as she grinned up at the bound man. Like I said, you're out of your league. She stopped picking her nails as she tossed the kunai from hand to hand, still grinning viciously as her visage became more and more demonic. Welcome to your own personal hell. With that she plunged the kunai into the man's chest, causing him to scream out in pain as the cold metal tore through his heart. However, to the man's horror, there was no blood, no sweet release of death, only the excruciating pain. When Yuya carelessly yanked the metal weapon from his chest, it was as if he had never been stabbed at all, save for the pain he could still feel. Did you think you'd die? His smirk became even more cruel as she spanned the kunai by the hole at its grip. We're only just getting started. Birds scattered from the trees as the man's scream continued to echo through the forest, like music to Yuya's ears. The redhead stood over her opponent's unconscious form, sliding her elegant metal flute back down to its resting place in her chest bindings and huffing with irritation. Damn, no challenge at all, falling for a weak genjutsu like that. She nudged the dark-haired man with her foot, hearing him whimper in his unconscious stupor as he rolled up into a tighter ball. The redhead grimaced as she took a step back from him. Aw fuck, I think he pissed himself. She sighed as she took another step back, looking around at her surroundings and realizing she had no idea where she was. With another irritable sigh, she walked off into the trees, figuring she better get back to her friends before they came looking for her. Damn, guess I got a bit carried away.